Dear colleagues, please be seated. We can begin if everyone could please be seated. Thank you. So colleagues, we adopt the agenda. If there are no objections, the agenda is adopted. And we begin with our chair's announcements. There is only one. We open our hearing of 3 shortlisted candidates for the position of European Chief Prosecutor. In this procedure, colleagues, according to Article 14 of Regulation 2017-1939, the European Parliament and Council are called on to appoint by common accord the European Chief Prosecutor for a non-renewable term of 7 years on the basis of a list drawn up by a panel selection laid down by the same article following a public call for candidates. Today we will hear individually the 3 shortlisted candidates, and I'd like to colleagues, for colleagues who are entering the room, please do so quietly. I'd like to remind you that LIBE has submitted a preparatory questionnaire to the shortlisted candidates with 3 questions. The shortlisted candidates have replied in writing to the questionnaire, and the answers have been circulated to members in all languages. Before drawing by lot the name of the first candidate, could I please welcome Ms Grassler, the Chair of the Cont Committee, as well as all the Cont members who are present. Welcome. As colleagues know, the Cont Committee is involved in this hearing in the question and answer session. The organisation of the hearing is following the principles set by President Tajani in his letter of the 21st of February, which was circulated to all members. So I'm going to give now the floor to the Cont Chair, Ms Gressler, for 2 to 3 minutes. Ms Gressler, please take the floor.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank you for your presence. It's a pleasure to have this joint hearing. I'll remind you that the only competence of the European Public Prosecutor are the financial interests of the European Union. Today, our committees are meeting together. We're pleased that after 20 years of work, we have finally got to a point where we can select the person who will be the Chief Prosecutor. So I think there's only one thing that we can do. Whoever it's going to be, we can only wish the Chief Prosecutor the best of luck in their work. And I hope that with our shared competence, we'll be able to continue with the development of this important institution.
Thank you very much, Ms Gressler. So, colleagues, we're now going to continue with the procedure, and I'm going to draw the name of the first candidate to be heard from this envelope. The names of 3 candidates are in this envelope. This is all very exciting. So I'm going to put my hand in this envelope and draw the name of the first candidate. There are 3 names of 3 candidates. Okay, thank you for that point of order, Mrs McAvey. That was very helpful. Okay, I have drawn the name of the first candidate, and it's Andres Ritter. So, colleagues, just let me explain. The candidates will be seated at the end of this podium here. Not usually we have a podium at the front, just to be clear. They will be made comfortable here. They've given time to come. We will be timing all candidates strictly. Everyone will have exactly the same time, and we will. They have been informed that we will strictly time each candidate. So we'll ask Mr. Ritter to please come to the front. So he's going to have a couple of minutes to do this. Okay, so colleagues, following the drawing of that first name, we proceed in alphabetical order. So the first candidate will be Mr. Ritter, then Bonnert, and then Kovesi for the third candidate. So in this order. And we will welcome the first candidate in a couple of minutes. And there's nothing else for me to do in that time? Ah, yeah. So colleagues, while the candidate is coming in, Perhaps I could give you some information about how we will structure the hearing. The candidate is invited to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 7 minutes. After the introduction, there will be time for a question and answer session of 63 minutes. 14 questions will be asked by LIBE members, that's 2/3 of the time, 7 by CONT members, 1/3 of the time. Each question and answer slot will be of 3 minutes, 1 minute question followed by 2-minute answers. Please be aware also that Ms Gressler and I will have to be very strict in ensuring that the speaking time is respected. So speakers will be cut off if they exceed the time respectfully. Otherwise, the last speakers, of course, will have no time left for their questions.
Point of order by Mr. Sugar.
Mr Shogar, do you have a point of order? No, you just want to speak. No, there's a list of speakers. Okay, that's fine. So interpretation is provided and you can use your own language, keeping in mind what you say needs to be interpreted. So just a guidance not to speak too quickly. And that's it. So we just wait now for our first candidate. Where's the first candidate coming from?
From a waiting room in the protocol room.
So the candidates are coming from a waiting room in the protocol area, so it takes them 1 or 2 minutes to arrive. So we just wait patiently, please, for 1 to 2 minutes, and the candidate will arrive. Okay, colleagues, ask the first candidate to make himself comfortable. We have Mr. Ritter to be the first candidate. Colleagues, if you could please settle, thank you. If you give the candidates the respect of just settling down. Colleagues, the first candidate's about to make his presentation, so it'd be best if colleagues who are standing, try to settle. Okay, so the first candidate, Mr. Ritter, will have 7 minutes to make his presentation. Mr. Ritter, please watch the timer. Once the time is over, you have to stop. And when you're asked questions, it'll be 1 minute question followed by a 2-minute answer, all of which will be timed strictly for all candidates, and we will adhere to the timer. So, if you're ready, and if everyone else is ready, we will begin with your presentation for 7 minutes. Thank you. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, honourable members, although it seems to be obvious, the core question is, why do we need the EPPO? Or put in other words, where are we coming from without the EPPO, and where are we heading to with the EPPO? Fraud and corruption against the union budget damage the financial resources of the European Union. However, and you know that well, there is also a wider dimension. Fraud and corruption also weaken the credibility of the Union in the eyes of taxpayers. Thus, a forceful protection of its financial interests constitutes a vitally important matter. 3 main reasons can be identified why criminal prosecution in PIF has not been as efficient as possible. They are all linked to the fact that prosecution followed, up to now, mainly a national approach. First, the criminal policy with regard to PIF has been fragmented. Despite all achievements, a national approach could not be sufficient to tackle a union-wide problem. It is therefore a decisive step forward that EPPO is entitled to formulate and implement its own criminal policy. It means a new approach from a new perspective. And that, of course, can only be achieved by a fully independent body. Second, national justice systems have not always been keen to investigate and to prosecute cross-border implications of a crime, limiting themselves to the national aspects. For this reason, a single supranational office is needed. It is able to see the bigger picture, thus being able to carry out comprehensive investigations. Third, a practical reason for inefficient investigations in PIF offences has been the lack of resources at the national level. Experience in white-collar crime teaches that resources are practically always limited when it comes to complex criminal activity. Thus, it is most important to use the resources at your disposal effectively, to pool capabilities and efforts, to create synergies, and to establish good cooperation with all stakeholders. At union level, main stakeholders are, of course, OLAF, Eurojust, and Europol. Synergies with those EU bodies will result from the working agreements to be settled. The relation with OLAF is, of course, particularly important. They play, as you all know, complementary roles. They cover 2 sides of the same coin. Nevertheless, that does not diminish the important role that Eurojust and Europol will play within the mandates to support the EPPO. In view of the efficient use of resources I was talking about, I think it is of utmost importance that the relation of the EPPO with all these union bodies is neither overlapping nor leaves a gap in PIF. Despite its supranational character, EPPO is reliant on the cooperation with the participating member states in particular concerning the information that is to be provided for by the national authorities. The swift and reliable flow and exchange of information will be crucial for EPPO's work. In relation to non-participating member states, I am confident that good cooperation can be established on a case-by-case basis. The regime foreseen in the regulation enables such cooperation. However, in my view, an own set of legal instruments with those member states would provide for legal security and legal clarity. As far as the internal organization is concerned, EPPO has a complex decision-making process. I think nobody could doubt about that. That is why the European Chief Prosecutor has the task, together with the College, to make the decision process as swift as possible. The internal rules of procedure must be clear, determined, and practicable. I see the role of the European Chief Prosecutor as driving force, as promoter of a good and efficient working practice. Regarding the individual cases to be handled by EPPO, reciprocal and real-time information, if possible, between the delegated European prosecutor and the permanent chamber will be key to proper decision-making. This applies all the more where several European delegated prosecutors will be working together in cross-border cases. Thus, all said, the establishment of EPPO represents a huge step forward. Above that, EPPO is a key element, but not the only one, in a completely new legal landscape in the field of PIF. To keep its promise to European taxpayer, its success depends on how it fits and works in a completely new and convergent PIF system. Last but not least, in my opinion, the accountability of EPPO towards this High House is not a restriction of its independence, but a safeguard of independence itself. And to conclude, I would like to express a prosecutor's view on the very sense of good and effective prosecution. It's my belief that prosecutors always should be guardians of the law. Their credibility and trustworthiness follow from their commitment to the rule of law. Accordingly, good and effective prosecution is by all means linked to a strict respect of procedural safeguards and individual rights as enshrined both in union law and in the national legal orders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ritter. You were the first candidate. I didn't want to interrupt you, but there was a lot of movement in the room, more than is necessary, and I do apologise if this put you off. You were the first. I really hope colleagues minimise the amount of movement. This is also a job interview as well as a hearing, so just out of respect for the candidates. As I put this on record, it was not easy, but to interrupt you would have been worse. So anyway, thank you for your presentation. We now move straight to the questions, and we begin with Mrs. Metsola for the EPP for a 1-minute question.
Thank you, Mr. Ritter. Thank you for your presentation. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experience in dealing with high-profile cases facing public and media attention, since the EPPO will have to deal with some of the biggest, toughest, and even politically charged cases? We have seen cases around Europe where natural prosecution or law enforcement authorities either refuse to take action or refuse to investigate, let alone prosecute clear criminal offences. How would you deal with non-cooperative member states in this regard? And finally, can you give us some examples of methods used by criminal organisations to defraud the EU budget, and how would you intend to tackle them? Thank you.
And a 2-minute answer, please, Mr. Ritter.
Thank you for that question. Now, I think it is one of the most important questions that you've put to me there. As I said, the role of a public prosecutor is to stick to the principle of the rule of law. If there is an awareness of a possible criminal offence, then the public prosecutor has to intervene. The support that the prosecutor receives depends upon the structure of the organization that the prosecutor belongs to. Because the European public prosecutor has a certain amount of independence and is set up as a European institution, then I think that that makes it possible to make it clear in public discourse as well that this is the principle that has to be followed. The principle is that the European public prosecutor can bring a case through to prosecution even if an individual member state resists. That's something that will have to be tested in practice. But I'm depending upon the support of the European Parliament. When I report back to the Parliament, I hope that you would be present and support me. But it does depend on the power that the prosecutor actually has to be able to assert the principle of the rule of law. We have had cases in my own prosecution service where we saw that we were able to be of use to the European taxpayer, where we as public prosecutors are closely scrutinized by political mandate holders. The question is, we need to be aware of the pressures that are out there.
Don't exceed it. That's your first warning. Don't exceed the time. Thank you. Second question, Mrs. Sippel from the S&D. 1 minute question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ritter, could you please explain in which way you fulfill or comply with all the requirements needed for the position of the Chief Prosecutor of EPO as listed under Article 14 of the regulation, and specifically I cite that your independence is beyond a doubt, that you possess the qualifications required for appointment to the highest prosecutorial and judicial offices in the respective member states, and end of citation. And could you also tell us since when you do fulfill those requirements? Thank you.
2 minute answer, please, Mr. Ritter.
Also die Antwort ist auf dem deutschen System vielleicht.
It's a bit difficult to understand the references to the German system. The presumption of independence comes when we enter into service. As a prosecutor, you must be objectively independent. And obviously, there is no particular check on whether you have that independence or not. It may not even be necessary in that form. That's what I would say about independence. The further preconditions which are established for highest office are that you should be qualified for that, and in Germany that is achieved by having gone through various phases or times of testing in higher office to see whether you're capable of meeting the personal and management capabilities, whether you are thus qualified to lead such an authority, and in the course of my career I've fulfilled that. If you're asking about my independence per se, I can say that for me independence is a very important aspect, for which reason I'm a member of the International Union of Judges, and I've been involved in the drafting of the Universal Statute of Judges, and I've also been active in the Committee on Criminal Law and Procedure. I've been active there, and also I've been active in the German Association of Judges, and I've been asked the relevant questions there and have thus proved it.
And for the ECR, Mrs. Helga Stevens, for 1 minute, please. My apologies, she's not here. We go straight to Mrs. Housemanova for Audi, please. 1 minute.
Merci, Président. Monsieur Ritter. Thank you very much, Chair. I've got a question for you, Mr. Ritter, following on from your written replies. It's a two-part question, and the first part is on future relations between the EPP and the non-participating members, and how do you see the links with Eurojust for the European prosecutor? Something that is newly created so that non-participating countries do not hinder the work of the EPPO and encouraging them to join the EPPO. And then the second part is on the work of the EPPO itself. Now, one of the concerns when drafting the regulation for this was that it would not be completely European and that national interests would prevail with the delegated prosecutors. And so what measures would you take to ensure that there is an EPO that is really European and really independent? Thank you.
Mr. Ritter, please, 2 minutes.
Well, on your first question about the member states that don't take part, well, and Eurojust, of course, Eurojust's role is very important. Eurojust is going to remain competent for those crimes where a crime has taken place in the non-participating member states. The possibility, in line with the Eurojust regulation and the EPPO regulation, suggests that otherwise they would be working together, and the Eurojust would have the responsibility of getting the EPPO on board in a joint investigation team. That's the possibility that we have in trying to protect the financial interest of the Union. Otherwise, it would be only a fragmented protection. Through the close involvement of the EPPO, Eurojust can make a major contribution to making this effective cooperation that can extend to the non-participating member states. Well, how is this going to work? Of course, there's going to have to be a lot of negotiations between the EPPO and the member states. Replacing a European delegated prosecutor with another could be an important possibility. And of course, the colleagues who fulfill that function will have to also fulfill the principle of independence, and they're going to have to follow very strict criteria that are set down in the regulation. Thank you.
Eva Joly for the Greens, please. 1 minute. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Ritter, I wanted to ask you a question. Now, in the structure of the EPPO, there will be chambers with national prosecutors who would be in charge of an inquiry or an investigation concerning one of the member states where that investigation will be given to a delegated prosecutor. Now, what would you do if that delegated prosecutor weren't to act? How would you deal with that situation? And I don't think it's purely academic, because unfortunately in my country we do have a situation where very often prosecutors are too close to power. Thank you.
Ritter, please.
Very grateful for that question, because I myself have considered that question since I've been engaged with the EPPO. What options would I have if a delegated prosecutor, for whatever reason, did not act according to the mandate allotted to them? Now, I think the colleague would have to be someone wholly suited for this role in the European prosecution system, so it's about the choice. Then, is there an option under the regulation to have the country's concerned take over the investigations themselves. Now, certainly this would be an additional charge on the system if that were to happen. I think the best weapon is the pressure exercised by a European public prosecutor, the pressure from the public prosecutor on the individual member states to ensure that a successful conclusion was reached. I have to be honest, I'm not sure myself how, in such a situation, it could tangibly be organised differently than through an attempt to work to an agreement with the member state to see whether there could be the replacement of the prosecutor, whether that would be the best way of achieving the investigation, or whether the EBPO could take over the role from the member state with all that would entail.
Emil Radev for the EPP, please, 1 minute.
Mr. Ritter, yours is an impressive career. Your CV shows that you have rich experience nationally and internationally. You've probably had many high-profile, even sensitive cases involving fraud with EU funds. Now, cases like these will be part of your daily work as a European prosecutor, and it is to you that all the questions about the progress of such cases will be addressed. So, could you give us an example of a case involving fraud with EU funds on which you worked, and more particularly the way in which you coped with media attention and public expectations? Also, how do you see the future development and functioning of the EPPO? Thank you.
Mr. Ritter.
Also ich darf vielleicht mit dem zweiten Teil der Frage.
Well, allow me to start with the second part of that question. As I said in my opening remarks, I really do believe strongly that the full protection of the EU's financial interests are only possible if there is a Europe-wide approach, an authority that is independent and has the necessary resources, and has a strategy and a policy to be coherent in combating a Europe-wide phenomenon. If you ask me what the largest case is in which I've been involved personally, then I can't tell you everything about the case because it is a case that has not yet been fully concluded, but it is a case in which there was an artificial division of a project to avoid the subsidy policies of the European Union. It was a 32 million euro shortfall in revenue, and political office holders have been involved in this case in line with the accusations leveled by the prosecutors. I have been involved in the investigation for some time now. Olaf has also been involved in this case. We have come as far as charges. The accused were absolved at the first instant, but there is new evidence and the case is still continuing.
Thank you. Katerina Cinici for the S&D, please. 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Ritter, the relationship between the executive power and the prosecution service is regulated differently across member states. So, in which way would you promote the proactive role of the European delegated prosecutors in detecting and investigating PIF offences at national level in equal manner across member states? And how do you want to make sure that the requirement of independence under Article 6 of the APPO regulation are fully guaranteed across all levels of the EPPO? Thank you.
Frage. Ich denke, dass
Thank you for your question. I think rightly the independence that you raised in many of your questions is the key element that can guarantee that the European Public Prosecutor becomes a success story. Without that independence, little would have been achieved, in fact. And in my introductory statement, I said why I believed that that independence was required for a uniform, cohesive prosecution policy. It was urgently required. Now, if I've understood your question, it was about, once again, this aspect of how can we ensure that delegated prosecutors were sufficiently independent. But I think the regulation already answers that in that the preconditions are described that someone must fulfill in order to be selected as such. Let's not forget in this that the European Prosecutor General will be the one who, together with the College, will select the people who best meet this requirement of independence from the Member States, and will be actively involved in ensuring that the most suitable people are selected to guarantee that independence. That is the strongest mechanism and the strongest control that one can have. It's about the personal credibility of the candidates who are up for selection and then selected. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Mrs. Stevens has arrived, so I will give her the floor at the end to keep the balance of the groups intact, but I'll do that at the end. Next is Monica McAvey for the ECR. Please, 1 minute question. Thanks.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you. Since you're speaking your language, I shall speak mine. I've seen in your CV that in the last 8 years you've been in leadership roles. Could you tell us some details about your experience in management? How many people were you managing and what budget were you administering? And a second question, could you give us some case examples of fraud against European funds that you finalised? I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of ones which might have been finalised. And what about those involving high-level characters? And what about political opinion or reacting to political pressure? Can you say something about that, please?
Mr. Ritter.
Mit Ihrer letzten Frage, Frau McAvey, dann
Well, I'll start with your last question, Mrs. McAvey. Political pressure, well, thank goodness, I must say, is something that I haven't had to experience very much myself. I'm very grateful for the fact that my work as a public prosecutor is one that I've been able to follow my convictions without having to give in to pressure. Criticism? Well, yes, I have received criticism, but it's nothing comparable with what happens in a number of other countries. And I think I see the issue in the same light as you do. I myself am the chief prosecutor in an authority with 127 staff. I can't tell you the size of the budget that we manage because the budgetary side is dealt with by a different service. But over the last 14 years, I have had managerial functions, leading functions within public prosecution services. What I have learnt over that time is how important it is to not just to appreciate the and respect other people's work, but to also serve as an example and to motivate the staff to achieve results. I think that we've been able to do that in the Rostock's Public Prosecutors Agency. The specialized prosecutor for economic crime and for cybercrime and also for crime linked to terrorism has quite a broad range of competencies. I would love to tell you a lot more about other cases, but I'm afraid I'm out of time.
Thank you. And Ingeborg Gressler for the EPP. 1 minute. Thank you.
Ja, danke schön. Vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, you've got an excellent CV. I'm sure that all of the candidates have impressive CVs, but I'm interested as to your experiences that you've had to date with Olaf. You mentioned one case, and you mentioned cooperation with Olaf in your introductory statement, but I was wondering why only 50% of Olaf cases actually go through to national courts. That's one of the major reasons why we're actually setting up the Public Prosecutor's Office. So I realize that there are different views in the European Union, but what is the situation? What do we need to do differently?
Thank you, Frau Gressler.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gressler. It's a very important question. If you look at the recast Olaf regulation, then I think that this is an increasingly important issue. We've had the experience with Olaf that we, as German public prosecutors, have been able to work very well with them. And the decisive thing for us has been that Olaf has got years of experience as how cases are to be judged under European law from the administrative law side. The difficult part is that the criminal law side, it depends upon the administrative law. If something is against community law or not is something that Olaf can identify, but even when the objectives converge and investigations work at different levels, then there is an assessment, and Olaf's assessment is of very important significance. If Olaf's capacities can be used to use them appropriately in a criminal proceedings, then I think that we have succeeded. But the question is, what is the evidence value of Olaf evidence in a criminal case? That depends on the extent to which the evidence is admissible under national legal orders. What I could suggest is a good precondition for getting support from Olaf in a successful criminal proceeding is to ensure that procedural guarantees are observed. If these are brought on board in the work of Olaf, then I think that that's a good guarantee that they can also be used in criminal proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanya Fayon, please, for S&D.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Here I am. Have you ever dealt with complex transnational investigations?
The microphone.
No. Okay. Yes? Okay, sorry. So I start once again. Have you ever dealt with complex transnational investigations, specifically in a supranational body, requiring coordination, negotiations, or settling potential jurisdictional conflicts between national judicial authorities involved? What do you consider to be added value of the EPO, and how would you envisage demonstrating this added value to those member states which are currently not part of the EPPO in order to encourage them to also opt in at a later stage? Thank you.
Da der letzte Teil Ihrer Frage eine ist.
On the last part of your question, that's more political, so unfortunately I can't say so much about that. But in terms of the persuasive force of the work of the European Public Prosecutor is concerned, you're quite right. That can be a reason why you might manage to persuade people that it's better to be part of the system. I've had an opportunity in difficult cross-border investigations, such as Italy, the Czech Republic and Germany, in a case crossing the borders there, involving cross-border VAT fraud. And in that case, with the involvement of Eurojust, we had a common investigative group, and to that extent I can compare the work of a common investigative group under the Eurojust umbrella and how things may work under the European Public Prosecutor system. And I think there are areas where there would clearly be added value. Coordination itself will be much more friction-free than now in a common investigative group. Coordination of investigation is much simpler if you've got two public prosecutors working together or under the supervision of a permanent chamber, rather than pursuing the channel of legal assistance, even if you've got Eurojust coordinating an investigative group. It's difficult to swap investigations straight away. We've had criminal sentences brought, but it's hard to work across the border in other countries. You've got language problems as well. You need translation. You have to adapt to the other country's legal system. If you've got two colleagues directly working on it, with the findings being brought in directly, then you save a lot of time and you're much more efficient as compared to classical legal assistance cooperation, even if you're working within a common investigative team. So there is that clear opportunity.
And finally, for the LIBE members, Helga Stevens, please, for the ECR.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Ik wil er niets aan toevoegen.
Thank you very much, Chair. I don't want to add anything because Ms. Joly asked exactly the same question that I had prepared. Thank you.
We now go to the Cont questions. Okay.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich möchte an der Olaf-Frage noch mal.
Thank you very much. I'll continue with this Olaf question. You said at the outset a little bit about why there are problems with the national services when it comes to prosecutions. And I was wondering what you see as the role for Olaf administrative investigations when the public prosecutor's office is also working. Now, there should be complementarity, but there are different procedural rules, and I don't know if we can manage to get it to work, because you have the administrative investigation, and it might be overburdened in many ways. So how is Olaf going to have to change? I'm the rapporteur on the Olaf regulation, so you can actually give me your wish list.
Das ist sehr schön, dass ich mir dann auch gleich was...
Well, that's very nice that you're proposing to grant my wishes. Well, I would like plenty of staff, first of all, but I don't know if that's within your powers. No, indeed. Cooperation can work in such a manner that information exchange should work. Exchange of information is important, so that the EPPO knows when they have to get active and when not. But that's not enough. The information has to be exchanged in a cross-cutting manner. We need to know at any stage of the process, what can I do to ensure that asset recovery is going to work? And there may be cases where it's not just a question of criminal law, but also administrative law. In criminal law, we're talking about individuals. Then I can look at the assets of people to try and get the asset recovery. But I can't necessarily touch companies, whereas Olaf can do that. So precisely on asset recovery, there is a strong need for complementarity. It can't simply be a question of waiting to the end of the trial and the process and then getting active with the administrative side. No, this needs to work in parallel. There needs to be a division of labour between the Olaf and the EPPO. You can't simply say, there's the EPPO, Olaf provides the work, and then when the investigation is complete, then the other gets involved. But, I mean, that would be my main wish, that this would be ensured.
Kollegin Ayala Sender, bitte.
Mrs. Ayala Sender.
Danke, Frau Vorsitzende. Ja, Herr Ritter, eine weitere...
Mr. Ritter, a further question on your experience, in particular with a view to national public prosecutors. Could you say something briefly about that, and why your international experience and your national experience after reunification qualifies you for setting up such a new structure as the European Public Prosecutor's Office? Thank you.
Danke, Herr Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. Well, it's an unusual situation, as you indicate, back in the 1990s, starting to set up a public prosecutor's office in the former East Germany, former GDR, because things weren't set up in the way that they were in the western part of Germany. And that means that very soon we ventured into terrain which was done at a much later stage elsewhere. You can say that I very quickly got into administration in my CV. I was very early on involved in technical cooperation projects, which then took me to Latin America. I went to Chile and Paraguay, and in later years to Mexico too, looking at how a public prosecutor's office should be established and what were the main criteria underpinning the independence of the work and how the work should be organised in technical terms, and also in terms of my experience that I'd got under my belt, how that could be applied in that case. In 2000-2001, I had my initial experience. If I did the same thing again, I would come out with quite different advice, I must be honest, because in the meanwhile, I've been serving for 26 years now, and I've learned much more about how a public prosecutor's office can function best. That's what I've learned personally, things like distribution of labour, division of labour, and how things work. And then, of course, you've got the motivation of colleagues, and it's the way in which an authority is led that determines how much success it can achieve. And you need to make sure the basic conditions are in place. With this regulation setting up an EPPO, you've put the conditions in place, and now in a complex environment that must be put into practice.
Dankeschön. Frau Kollegin Makovej, bitte.
Mrs. Makovej.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you. I'd like to continue after the answer to the first question about the fact that you haven't gone under much political pressure, you haven't had that experience. How would you then proceed as the Prosecutor General, the Chief Prosecutor at the EPPO, if 22 countries of Eastern and Central Europe did put pressure on you? How would you deal with that?
Well, Mrs. Makovej, I'm very grateful for that question. What I can tell you is that the public prosecutor will have to work hard to be independent We must follow the rule of law strictly without considering which person we're dealing with. In order to ensure that, then I will have to be active. I realize there will be situations where this principle is not respected, and that's going to be very difficult. But what I can tell you is that independence, as such, doesn't mean that there are no political influences. Public prosecutors never work within a vacuum. Every activity of this public prosecutor can have political significance or political consequences, depending on who is being prosecuted. But part of the work of this public prosecutor is to be aware that that is the case, but not only to be aware of it, not to adapt to it, but rather to resist it. My colleagues across the European Union who are exposed to this pressure, but still manage to do their jobs and do their job correctly, then they are exemplary. They are working hard to ensure the rule of law. They show what independence really means. Well, thank you. Well, under normal conditions, we would get a round of applause for that. Mr. Ali is next.
Rita, first of all, I would like to thanks for the answers of the written questions. Also, it's admirable. Your CV is more than 26 years professional career, and more than 20 in the professional sphere. You mentioned in your answers that you have an experience with Olaf. The smooth and quick cooperation between EPPO and Olaf is a high priority. We need to ensure that this future relationship will not generate competencies disputes on slowdowns. Therefore, could you elaborate a bit more on it? In this regard, how would you envisage and ensure such cooperation, and mainly the communication and transmission of information? And my second question is, my political group, ALDE, has always been in favor of a centralized EPPO. The current EPPO has a hybrid structure with central and decentralized levels, which can be seen as quite complex to deal with. You'll have to ensure its swift and operational efficiency. Therefore, how will you make sure that this hybrid structure will work? And the other question is, how will you step up proper communication channels to process with swift exchanges of information between the European delegated prosecutors and with the national authorities involved? Thank you.
Herr Ritter, bitte schön.
Also, ganz konkret zu Ihrer
Specifically on your last question, cooperation can work only if you've got an information system in which information is actually made available both for the permanent chamber as for the delegated prosecutors. There has to be a real-time information system. That's the only way it can work. On your question as to how or whether, well, let's say it's a complex decision-making structure. It really is. But I'm convinced that the best way of getting a uniform policy would have been to have had a criminal prosecution procedure for the European Union in the first place. Now, of course, you would have needed so much harmonization in order to do that. You also have to know the national systems, the national particularities, how criminal prosecution works and so on. And without both together, I think it would have been very difficult to establish such a system in which you could have efficient and effective procedural enforcement at a European level. A purely vertical system would have been interesting, but in the current situation, a combination of the two structures, I think, is the best way to take the good points of both systems and forge them together to make an effective system. In terms of Olaf and the exchange of information with Olaf, I've already said that that really has to work in such a way that there is a penetration of information. It shouldn't just be initial information of interest to Olaf on a file. Can't just have that one-off. It has to be an ongoing exchange of information. Thank you. Mr. Javor, please.
Köszönöm szépen, elnök asszony, és üdvözlöm Ritter urat a meghallgatáson. Két kérdést szeretnék föltenni. Az egyik, hogy továbbra is több tagállam...
Unfortunately, there's a technical problem.
No translation? Okay, then I continue in English. So I would like to pose two questions. First, that still there are a number of member states not joining the EPPO. And what are you planning to do when in an investigation where the crime itself has a cross-border nature, you find that perhaps some parts of the investigation should be carried out in those member states where the EPPO is not entitled to investigate directly. So how can you ensure that all the unwilled criminal cases will be properly investigated, even if the investigation should be carried out partly in those member states which are not joining EPPO? And the other issue that there was a lot of talks about the exchange of information between Olaf and EPPO. But from the experiences of Olaf, we know that sometimes the real problem is the exchange of information between the member state authorities and the European bodies, Olaf, and this could be the case with EPPO. What can you do if you find that a member state or member state authorities systematically deny to provide the necessary information in an investigation?
Also Sie sprechen ein wichtiges...
Well, you're addressing a very important subject. I said it in my introductory remarks. Without enough information, the EPPO cannot be a success. Information needs to come from the member states. It needs to come from the community agencies. Without this information, the EPPO would have no cases to deal with. So we need to assert the right to this information so that it can function. The precondition is that we need to have a system for getting information from third parties, from whistleblowers, for example. There need to be ways to get information into the EPPO by alternative channels. The public prosecutor shouldn't only be taking cases from the member states, but should also be initiating cases itself. But asserting this requirement for information is key. As for cross-border activities with other countries that are not taking part, then it's important that Eurojust's functions can be made use of. Eurojust is competent for crimes identified in those member states, and they were supposed to work closely together with the EPPO. If we are going to put together a joint investigation team with the EPPO as a participant, plus the member state authorities in a non-participating member state, then I think the best way to coordinate investigations so that we can practically protect the financial interest of the Union would require this kind of cooperation, and I think that there should be specific instruments developed to carry out that cooperation.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ritter, I have two questions. The first question, in your long career, have you ever come across political, financial briefs or affairs, and have you actually had to then prosecute there? And then the second question, your point about your concerns about any possible political pressure that may be brought to bear on prosecutors in member states, and in particular, your colleague Ms. Kovesi has been roundly attacked by the government of her country, and I wanted to know what you thought of that, if, of course, you want to reply to that question. Thank you very much indeed.
Ich glaube, ich kann Ich kann mich in der Antwort...
I can keep the answer fairly brief. The answer to your first question, was I involved in such cases against political office holders and cases where political pressure was exercised on me? Office holders, yes, but not really political pressure in the sense meant. As regards the situation in other countries and the situation of one of the competing candidates, I regard it as a great honour that I belong to that circle of candidates, including Mrs. Kovesi. And I have the greatest admiration for her commitment and courage. And overall, I believe that one can say at this stage, at least as far as the other two candidates are concerned, that I really do feel honoured to be numbered in the same circle as them and to be here before you. Thank you.
Auf Ihren Slot.
The EFDD has given up their slot. Mrs. Pitera will start again at the beginning.
Dziękuję bardzo, Pani Przewodnicząca. Ja chciałam częściowo powrócić do kwestii, o której mówił już Pan poseł Jawor.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Javor already asked part of my question. All of the member states of the European Union are not supporting this initiative of the European Public Prosecutor. So there will be a lot of issues about how to cooperate with those member states who do not support the idea. That's going to be a very interesting issue. Second question, the member states that don't support the project are stating that the creation of a European Public Prosecutor's Office would take away independence from national prosecution services. So that's my question. Do you think that there is a threat there to the independence of national prosecution authorities? What would be your response to those concerns?
Also ich wüsste nicht, wie die Schaffung...
Now, I honestly don't understand how the creation of an EPPO, which has got the independence of its staff fully enshrined, could possibly limit the independence of national prosecution authorities. There are clearly defined competences where the EPPO is competent in that area. Independence is so clearly guaranteed by the regulation and in the intentions of the European Parliament, and with such accountability to you that I think it's impossible to say that the independence of national prosecution authorities should be undermined by the creation of an EPPO. I cannot understand that. Thank you very much.
Haushaltskontrollausschuss, danke für Ihre Zeit und die Antwort.
On behalf of the Budgetary Control Committee, I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you. It's been very interesting to hear from you.
Thank you, members, for your questions. I'd like to thank Mr. Ritter, to you for your participation today in the hearing. I want to let you know that after this hearing there will be a full evaluation, of course, of all the candidates. I'll give all members full details of how both committees will do this evaluation at the end of the participation of all three candidates. As requested by President Tajani, I will send the President of the Parliament a letter which will include also the CONT position. And we will be in touch. Thank you very much indeed for your participation. So, dear colleagues, the next candidate will be coming sooner than the last candidate. They're already on the way, so there won't be too much of a delay. So, just less than a minute, I understand. Colleagues, just again, the point I was making about movement and so on, thank you. Out of respect for the candidates, I appreciate it. Thank you. So, colleagues, we come to the second hearing, and we welcome Jean-Francois Bonner. I'm going to give the same information, you've heard it before, but for the information for the candidate who is with us for the first time, of course. So, the candidate is invited to make an opening oral statement of no more than 7 minutes. After our introduction, there will be time for a question and answer session of 63 minutes. 14 questions will be asked by LIBE members, 7 by CONT committee members. Each Q&A slot will be 3 minutes, 1 minute question and 2 minute answers. Please be aware that we will have to be very strict in ensuring that the speaking time is respected. Otherwise, the final speaker will have no time left. So we will time your speaking slot very strictly, and you would have to end. You'll see the timing on the screen. Interpretation is provided, and you can therefore use your own language, keeping in mind what you say needs to be interpreted. Therefore, please do not speak too quickly. And now, without further ado, Monsieur Bonner, we give you the floor for your presentation of 7 minutes, please. Please go ahead and welcome.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Members of the European Parliament, at this point, let me share a thought with you, or to think of Mr. Claude Hench, who was one of the previous members in 1997, mentioned for the first time the idea of having a European chief prosecutor. So here I am before you, ladies and gentlemen, today with 2 hats on. 2 lots of experience as a European judge, and then also experience as a prosecutor. So I was a judge for 20 years, and during those time I worked on operational cooperation in Europe. And it is that experience that I bring to you, because twice I have been given the chance to build or to participate in the building of 2 major instances of European judicial cooperation, the liaison magistrates and the birth of Eurojust, where I was the deputy representative for France. So let me just say, I am a European judge, but I am a convinced European as well. And I also have a lot of experience as a prosecutor, 32 years of my career in the Public Prosecutor's Office, and 14 of those spent fighting financial and economic crime across the board. To begin with, it was non-cash payment fraud, and then later on I was given cases that were an awful lot more difficult, an awful lot more important: VAT, money laundering, organised crime, corruption, misappropriation of public funds, and others. And then for another 10 years of my career, I have spent, and in actual fact this is still ongoing, working on as the chief prosecutor, first of all in a regional capacity, and now I am the Prosecutor General first of all at local level, I beg your pardon, and now at regional level. And so it is these 2 aspects of my experience that I would make available to the EPPO. I have brought together at work people working from all sorts of different levels of the legal and judicial world, and bringing them together also always in a multilingual and multicultural arena. And I would do everything I possibly could, but also try to bring together all the members of the European Public Prosecutor's Office into a team that was united, working together in a very calm atmosphere. And from my point of view, in order to achieve that, we'd have to have objectivity, independence, the respect of fundamental rights, and of course a code of conduct. And that means that people would have to work with consensus and of course an ounce of diplomacy, but always determination. And that determination really is what the chief prosecutor has to have. Thank you.
PPO will have to face from beginning three main challenges. The EPO needs, first of all, credibility as a new European body in the midst of European and national judicial authorities, institutions, and law enforcement agencies. The main responsibility of the European Chief Prosecutor is to lead EPPO to acquire legitimacy as a precondition of credibility. At second, the EPPO needs to convince the 22 participating member states to work with EPPO and to hand over the cases of its competence. It needs also to convince the 6 other member states non-participating in the EPPO in order to assist EPPO whenever necessary. All other EU agencies have also to be convinced. I mean here especially Olaf, Eurojust, and Europol. And the main link between the 4, including EPPO, will have to be mutual trust. At least, don't forget that EPPO has to provide also new perspectives for Europe. Since we know it, the democratic foundation is disputed and questioned in several member states of the European Union. By fighting efficiently against PIF offences and against all related criminality, including corruption, EPO will appear definitely as a new tool of democratic trust. Zum Schluss, meine Damen und Herren, ich bin...
To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I have just crossed the Konrad Adenauer Bridge or walkway, and I would like to spare a thought for the Federal Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who told us once that world history is also the sum of the avoidable incidents. And when constructing a European Public Prosecutor's Office, we face a massive challenge, but at the same time, a major opportunity, a new instrument for democratic confidence can be put in place. And ladies and gentlemen, under no circumstances should we let that chance slip through our fingers. We owe this to our fellow citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Bonner. We now begin with the questions, and we go straight to our members, and we begin with the EPP and Mr. Engel for 1 minute, please.
Merci Claude. Et Monsieur Bonner, vous portez le même nom que mon ancien.
Well, Mr. Bonnet, you have the same name as my old school headmaster. So that already gives me warm feelings in your regard. You mentioned the member states that are part of the system, but some member states have chosen not to be part of it. And they feel that they have good reasons for not taking part. It's not just abstract concerns of national sovereignty. So what I wanted to ask you is that if you were to take this role, how could the office convince those member states that are not yet part of the prosecutor's office? And how can we try and prevent the kind of negative campaigns like the one that we're seeing from the Romanian government about the Romanian candidate for your post? I think these are things you could describe as avoidable.
For 2 minutes, please.
Yes. Je vous répondrai effectivement.
Well, I'll respond to the first part of your question, first of all. The prosecutor has to prove itself in practice. It has to demonstrate its capacity, its ability to struggle effectively against all attacks on the financial interests of the European Union. That is the focus of the job. I'm not going to be forgetting about other kinds of crimes, corruption, organized crime. These are major issues. But they would have to have a link to the financial interests of the Union. That's the first target. And showing our capacity to struggle against these crimes effectively by setting an example, then maybe those 6 other member states will be impressed to see how we work through learning by doing. Maybe things will develop. Secondly, well, indeed, the situation is one that is a big question for the prosecutor, particularly the chief prosecutor. I think that the response for the chief prosecutor has also always to be, what does the text say? What does the regulation say? It gives us a list of tasks. It provides a legal framework. It's up to us, for us to respect that legal framework and to demonstrate that by using the legislation we have available, the prosecutor is an independent authority, and the force of the European Public Prosecutor will be to respect this independence and to make it contagious, to spread it to other member states. You mentioned one, but there may be others that you have in mind.
Thank you. And for the S&D, for 1 minute, Mrs. Sippel, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bonat, having in mind the very different judicial systems in our member states, could you please explain in some more details in which way you fulfill or comply with all the requirements needed for position of chief prosecutor as listed under Article 14 of the regulation? And specifically, I cite that your independence is beyond doubt and that you possess the qualifications required for appointment to the highest prosecutorial or judicial office in your respective member state. That's it.
Many thanks for your question. The 2 main points here are independence and requirements. If I begin by the last point, I would say that as requirements, as I told you a couple of minutes before, I went through all positions within the prosecution service in France. Being a very young prosecutor, a senior prosecutor now, I had to use all the means that are given to the prosecution office in France to fulfill his activity. I'm today a prosecutor general, which is in France, like in other countries, the highest position within the prosecutorial office. So having been a young prosecutor, then an longer prosecutor in Europe, being used to work with other European authorities, and now as a senior prosecutor, I think that I fulfill all requirements stated by the EPPO regulation. As to the independence, sometimes we are questioned in France, saying, yeah, French system in former times was very hierarchical. So it means that Minister of Justice could, in the past, give instructions to the Prosecutor General and to the Chief Public Prosecutor. This has changed since now 6 years, and the Minister of Justice can no more issue instructions in individual cases to the public prosecutor. And this is quite a big change in our culture as public prosecutors in France. And I can assure you, I see it also with my junior prosecutors having this new culture in mind.
And thank you. Sorry to enforce the time, but in fairness to all candidates. Next, Helga Stevens for the ECR. 1 minute, please.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Collega's, meneer Bonner, u heeft in uw geschreven antwoorden de complexe relatie.
No, I haven't got it from Spanish. Oh, it's going into English. No?
Om grensoverschrijdende zaken met betrokkenheid van die lidstaten.
Sorry, technical problem again.
There wasn't translation. Perhaps can we begin again to the interpreters?
There wasn't translation.
Not in English.
No, there was a technical problem. We can try again.
Let's just start
Should
again,
I
please.
switch to English or?
No, just start again, please. Just if you don't mind. Thank you. Thank you. Start again, thanks, and we'll start.
Ja, meneer Bonner. U heeft in uw geschreven.
Mr. Bonnet, in your written answers to the connections between the EPPO and the non-participating member states, could you give us some more details on that and what resources the EPPO has to deal with cross-border investigations involving the non-participating member states? There may be political reasons for non-participation, and it may be that there is political pressure exercised. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. Sorry for the interruption, Mr. Bonner.
Ja, graag bedankt voor de vraag. Het is helemaal belangrijk.
Thank you for that very important question. It's very important to take into account that point of view.
Mais c'est la spontanéité. Madame, oui, sans...
Well, without further delay, Madam, in terms of the non-participating countries, there is indeed part of the rules today showing that non-participating member states are bound to the other member states by the principle of sincere cooperation, and therefore the delegated European prosecutors, who are the root of the EPPO in the member states, are perfectly well positioned to send European judicial cooperation instruments such as investigative orders or the arrest warrants throughout the territory of the EU, which would include the non-participating countries, those not involved in enhanced cooperation. It's a bit more complicated, I know, in that the Commission is currently looking into the matter of whether there should potentially be a complementary instrument linking the European Public Prosecutor and the non-participating countries. I think this is still an open question which prompts a number of legal questions or difficulties. I don't know if they're difficulties as such. And if I were appointed, I know this would be one of my first priorities. I would check to ensure that the EPPO was in a position to work fully with these member states. I would like to recall that Eurojust was also an instrument allowing, where necessary, difficulties to be overcome, because Eurojust covers the full range of the 28 member states there are today of the EU.
And now we have Eva Joly, please, for the Greens. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Eva, sorry. My apologies. It wasn't in my note, but for the Audi group, Nathalie Griesbeck, please. Nathalie, sorry.
Merci, Président.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman.
Ma question sera posée en...
Thank you very much.
Et donc, elle n'est pas très éloignée de...
Thank you very much indeed. This question will be in French, and it's actually quite close to the question from Helga Stevens. In your presentation, you talked about your desire to make all of the different tools work together across the board. And my question is about the relationship between the EPPO and the member states that aren't currently participating in it. How are you going to use the Eurojust national correspondents for the EPPO? How are you going to use them? How are you going to make them work to make sure that the non-participating member states do not present obstacles to the EPPO work? You talked about trying to convince them in the future of joining the EPO. Then, very quickly, one of the concerns when we drafted the regulation on the EPO was that it wouldn't be sufficiently European and that national interests might prevail amongst delegated prosecutors. So what concrete measures do you envisage taking to ensure the proper implementation of a prosecution that is really independent and hopefully truly European?
Madame la députée, oui, effectivement.
Madam, well, yes, what you said on Eurojust, that in that respect, it is an essential job because it is the natural link between the EPPO and Eurojust. We're familiar today with Eurojust's ability and capacity to cover the entire territory of the European Union and even beyond, because Eurojust has signed cooperation agreements with other countries. You see, I have a broad view of cooperation because we have liaison magistrates with Norway, Switzerland, and cooperation agreements, and this faculty to decouple Eurojust's sphere of action. We, of course, need to get the Eurojust correspondence together quite quickly, establish very close working relationships with those individuals in order to finalize the axes of cooperation and establish channels for communication so that there is no overlap in work, but make sure that that work flows freely and makes progress rapidly in the way that Eurojust does now when it arranges a coordination agreement or a joint inquiry team. Now, on the delegated agent point, this is something that is close to my heart. Has been right from the beginning. According to the rules, it is possible to have a delegated European prosecutor with two hats and a prosecutor dedicated entirely to the European Prosecutor's Office. Now, we need a balance and close cooperation with member states that would like to have that dual role, because there is some potential for difficulty, some things that might have to be smoothed over, and that would be the job of the Chief Prosecutor.
Thank you. And now Eva Joly, please. My apologies for earlier. For the Greens.
Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Prosecutor General, I'd like to know your stance on the possible broadening of the powers of the EPO to include terrorism and possibly environmental crimes. I'd also like to know if you, as the person responsible for the General Prosecution Service, well, you might be fully independent when it comes to your work in Reims, but we saw with the Ben Allah affair that there isn't necessarily that independence in Paris, but I would like to know if you would be prepared to start investigations on the basis of the Panama Papers and the industry of money laundering that a number of banks are involved with, also possibly French banks.
Je vous remercie, Madame la députée. Alors, s'agissant...
Thank you very much. On the question of widening the area of competence, that's the question everyone is looking to. And in the genes of the EPO, once like an aeroplane, it's taken off and it's reached its cruising speed. It's liable to develop, to evolve, to acquire under new powers under Article 86 of Lisbon. And that's in the DNA of the EPO. But let's be careful. Let's proceed, as they say in the UK, step by step. It's important for the EPO to be able to maintain its height. It's like an engine. It's got to be cranked up. It's got to be able to go up a gear, maintain the distance, and then really arrive at its destination. But I think that in this area, there is room for reflection. Terrorism is one area which could be captured. Environmental crime, because there are environmental crimes, that could also be captured. The text says any infringements coming under the heading of serious cross-border transnational crime, and that's a wide open field. And personally, Madam, I do not rule out any of those areas. On the second question, as to independence, the Panama Papers, for example, in my remit, we have gone very carefully into every nook and cranny because there are areas, I don't tend to go into them now because it's really still underway, it's sub judice, but there are already competences of the General Prosecutor, less of the Justice Minister, to go and supervise, to monitor the work of the prosecutors under my authority. That work has been undertaken. We will continue to do that. I think that that's the job of a prosecutor who is the head of the EPO.
I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm making too many mistakes here. Barbara Spinelli. Barbara, for the GUE group, please.
Grazie, Presidente. Io vorrei...
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. de Bonnert. I've no doubts about the independence of EPO, but I've got major doubts about the independence of the prosecutors' offices in the Member States. For example, I do not agree with the very positive assessment as to the independence of justice in France and the prosecuting service in France. What I'd like to hear from you is what are the concrete instruments, the practical tools available to underpin independence? Because there are member states which have got a very tenuous degree of independence, a weak form of independence. And it's not sufficient to say you've got to use your powers of persuasion, you've got to set an example, create conducive environments. That and be a polyglot. I don't think that's sufficient. I think that you do need tact and diplomacy, but the EPO, I don't want you to be diplomatic at all. I want you to come right out and say it.
Sì, grazie per la questione. Madame la députée, je dirais que le...
Madam, I would say that the European prosecutor needs a great ability for diplomacy. You're quite right about independence. It's not something that is decreed. And when I talk about the independence of the prosecutor's office in France, mentalities have changed. We've seen that for 6 years now. I'm saying that because I'm experiencing this from the inside. I'm giving you my own experience here on my own personal position. If I were to lead the European Prosecutor's Office, you know that I am soon going to be 58 years with a 7-year mandate. I'll be 65 by that time. I expect nothing from the French authorities. I would be fully independent if I am appointed European prosecutor. I can reassure you. On the instruments, and you're quite right to stress this, it's up to the chief prosecutor to check on a daily basis via the European prosecutors, via the work in the standing chambers, how the delegated prosecutors, the European delegated prosecutors, who are this permanent thermometer, if you like, to check what is going on. And if there are irregularities or departures observed from independence, then it would be up to the chief of the European Prosecutor's Office, as I've seen in Eurojust, madam, in my own experience, where there is a dysfunction, poor cooperation with the state. Then, in Eurojust's annual report, we stated that, and there were consequences. With my appointment as European prosecutor, I would be accountable to you, and I would come to you and point fingers at whatever member state was in question.
Thank you very much. In addition to what you told us already, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience in dealing with high-profile cases, particularly ones that faced both media and public attention? Now, as we know, the EPPO will have to deal with some of the toughest and politically charged cases. We have seen situations around Europe where national prosecution or law enforcement authorities either refuse to take action or refuse to investigate, let alone prosecute clear criminal offences. In this regard, how would you deal with member states that do not cooperate? And can you give us some concrete examples used by criminal gangs and organisations with the intention to defraud the European Union budget, and how would you tackle those instances?
As to the media, I can tell you that I had quite huge experience in my former position as a chief public prosecutor, when I had to prosecute one high-ranking person being a high civil servant, with whom I had to work regularly once a week in the circle of our what we call préfecture, you see, high position administrative of the town and of the region. And this person being a chief, as a civil servant, head of administration, I had to prosecute this person for abuse of public goods. And this went very quickly, not from my side, but from syndicates to the media. And I had to go ahead with prosecution, keeping always in mind impartiality, being strictly objective, looking for evidence in both sides, against this person and for her. So I had to tackle this on the prosecution service and as well with media. As to member states which would not be cooperative with EPPO, this will be the most responsibility both of the ECP and of the College, of course, because we have then to show our independence, to show that the European Chief Prosecutor is the stakeholder. And this means that, again, if problems are appearing, we as prosecutor, as European prosecutor, and the Chief Prosecutor is, of course, responsible, accountable before the Parliament, Council as well. So this will be a main point as well. I think that this should not be bared out of mind because it's very important.
Thank you. And Emilian Pavel for the S&D, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to see that we won't have any linguistical problems if you are appointed. The relationship prosecution service is regulated differently across states. In which way would you promote the proactive role of the European delegated prosecutors in detecting and investigating PIF offences at national level in equal manner across member states? And how do you want to make sure that the requirements of independence under Article 6 of the EPPO regulations are fully guaranteed across all levels of the EPPO? And I may add a second question, if you have time at the end of your 2 minutes. Do you consider having secret protocols with secret services from different member states in your activity to transfer or to gather information from them that may help you in your investigations or in the EPPO investigations? Thank you.
Merci. S'agissant tout.
Thank you. Well, first of all, with regard to the delegate European prosecutors, I think that's one of the strengths of the EPO. And I said this earlier on, and I'm quite happy to really stress this. The delegated European prosecutors are the ones who are a constant link with the national prosecution services. So for the European prosecutor, they're important, but they're also important for the member states across the board, the member states that are participating. It's very important then to have the delegated European prosecutor placed in a strategic location in order for that person to be able to receive information and be au fait with most important fraud dossiers in order for them to be able to transmit them further to the European level. But that's not enough in itself. If you have 2 or 3 delegated European prosecutors covering a large area, then you might also need to think of the idea of these different delegated prosecutors also being in contact with prosecution services in other member states. So I think that is the way we would be able to get information to move up the chain to the European level. And then, of course, the big cases are the ones that come under criticism today because they're not being dealt with properly. We have to make sure they get onto the radar, and I think that's why we have to act very quickly to set up these mechanisms from the start. On your second question, well, that's very interesting. Why? Because increasingly we're seeing intelligence, information being available, and European secret services are not privileged interlocutors of the EPO for me. I actually often work with services that provide evidence, legal evidence to me. And as a European public prosecutor, I think I would have to work in exactly the same way.
Monica McAvey, please, for the ECR.
Mulțumesc. Thank you very much indeed. First question. Do you think that the role of the Chief Prosecutor of EPO is more one of a coordinator and a diplomatic coordinator between the member states, rather that than actually effectively working on all of the different cases of fraud I'm thinking of there? Second question. What crimes fall under the EPO jurisdiction? Can you give us some examples, apart from fraud involving European funds and VAT at European level? Can you give us other examples? What other crimes are in that jurisdiction?
Vă mulțumesc. Madame la députée,
Madam, I can respond to those 2 points. The chief European prosecutor needs both those abilities. The ability to coordinate, first of all, which means needs to have some kind of diplomacy, but that's not enough. He needs to be familiar with the material. When people start talking about money laundering and cross-border fraud, that person needs to be familiar with the mechanisms, the conditions that characterize each infringement. So first and foremost, he's a magistrate, a technician in the prosecutor's office, and that is why I am standing for this post today. But the job conferred upon him under the regulation is also to be the ability to be able to make the prosecutor's office function correctly with all the other institutions, including, first and foremost, member states, be they participants or not. So it's not really a dual job, it's a multi-task job. So I believe that being a technician is indispensable, yet insufficient. On the list of crimes, well, when we talk about PIF offensements, we're thinking about VAT fraud, carousel fraud are the most prominent crimes, but we need to bear in mind the list of competences under the PPO regulation, which simply makes reference to the PIF directive, which lists those infringements. There's all sorts of infringement in there, money laundering, a whole host of different infringements which may affect the interests of the Union.
For the EPP, Mr. Radev.
Благодаря, господин председател. Уважаеми господин Бонарт, имайки предвид вашия богат опит във френската прокуратура и на европейско ниво, включително при създаване на Евроюст, вие наистина осъзнавате предизвикателствата.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Can you start again, please?
Имайки предвид вашия богат опит във френската прокуратура и на...
Thank you very much. Mr. Bonner, you have got long experience in the French system and also long experience at European level, particularly with the setting up of Eurojust.
Relay, that's why it takes time. It takes a bit of time. It's a relay language.
Okay, it takes a bit of time. We can have some time allowance. Can we wait? There is French interpretation. Okay. So sorry, Mr. Rada, for the third time. If you can start and with time.
My Bulgarian is not so good.
Okay, you really disappoint us, Monsieur Bonner. Really, honestly. I mean, really.
Имайки предвид вашия богат опит.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You have, Mr. Bonner, you have got long experience, both in France and at the EU level. You know the challenges which lie ahead of the EPPO. In your letter and in your replies to the questions, you talk about the need for a balance, to strike a balance, saying that the rules of all the chambers must be respected. You talk about a dialogue and consensus. And I wonder, could you just elaborate on how exactly that dialogue between the chambers, the European prosecutor, and the delegated prosecutors would be organised so that you get positive results in the investigations? You also made mention of the possibility of specialisation either on the substance or geographically. What exactly, how would that look? Now, the work of getting the EPO entrenched in the public mind, how would you put it on the map? Thank you.
Blagodaria. That's the only one. Monsieur le député.
Dear Sir, well, when it comes to how the chambers will work, I'd set out that in my letter to an extent, but I think it's a very sensitive issue that has to be dealt with from the outset. Why? Because within the very structure of how the EPO will work, the chambers, permanent chambers, will actually be the beating heart of the organisation, and that is where the cases will be followed in an operational way. And that means that the head of the EPO needs to make sure that the burden is fairly distributed across the different chambers in terms of the caseload. So we have to keep a very close eye on that, and the composition and specialisation and the different subjects that will be distributed. So it's up to the chief prosecutor of the EPO, yes, because then we have to make sure that is properly articulated at an operational level with the delegated prosecutors who, working with the member states, will then be in a position to push information up the chain, but also trickle information down the chain with regards to the request for investigation that will be issued by the European prosecutors in these permanent chambers. So trying to get the right balance is very important. The regulation says that the work will be distributed at random. And we have to try to harness that, perhaps set out a form of specialisation that we can envisage, either geographically or from a functional, operational point of view. We'll have to see what happens at the beginning and how things pan out, because the beginning will give an indication of how we can move on in the future, and we have to set out the different options without writing anything in stone.
Finally, for the LIBE committee, the final question from Dietmar Koster from the S&D.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I'm here. Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can see that you've been very well lit there. You're okay. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Bonnet. My question is the following. Have you ever dealt with complex transnational investigations, specifically in a supranational body, requiring coordination, negotiations or settling potential jurisdictional conflicts between the national judicial authorities involved? What do you consider to be the added value to the EPPO, and how would you envisage demonstrating this added value to those member states which are currently not part of the EPPO, in order to encourage them to also opt in at a later stage? And do you have any experience in the cases of money laundering? Thank you.
Ma réponse sera la suivante.
Well, I can answer.
On the subject of coordination and negotiation in transnational cases, well, let me just give you my own past experience in Eurojust, where I had the enormous privilege of chairing a coordination meeting where in a case of money laundering and transnational fraud, which involved 5 countries, not member states, but 5 countries, including Switzerland, which is not a member state, but which was present, and which we got to Eurojust because of a cooperation agreement signed with Switzerland. In one day, we were able to decide jointly on searches, a raid, in a dozen banks on the same day. And it was the Belgian examining magistrate, because that was the way in, who came. And we said, Your Honour, when would you be able to organise these raids? This was in order to seize criminal assets simultaneously, and not, it was to be on the same day at the same time. And at the end of that coordination meeting, a date was set. The decision was taken, and in the 5 countries, including Switzerland, the searches took place and the assets were seized. And that ran into 10 million euros. And 80% of that was actually confiscated and seized. And if you can get that result in Eurojust, then I think if we can do that in the EPO, then I think that we will prove the added value and say that this is something on top of national jurisdictions. And I believe that the European, the EPO, EPPO, we will be able to demonstrate that there is indeed an added value. Thank you.
Die Haushaltskontrolle macht weiter.
Okay, budget control is picking up where the others left off. Very impressive. I just wanted to ask you about this link with Olaf. What role do you see for Olaf in administrative investigations? It's a strange thing, administrative investigations. Not all member states have that. We have a lot of problems with Olaf cases in this context. So what's your take on this? What's your take on the future role of Olaf? I'm rapporteur for the future role of Olaf, so I was just wondering what your views are. On those administrative investigations, it's true that it is a question for the European Prosecutor's Office, whereby we're talking about judicial investigations. And the big topic there is the link between EPPO and Olaf, how the two can cooperate, where you have administrative and judicial tasks to be carried out. I believe that progress needs to be made there. As I've said, it's a big challenge. It's a challenge we need to face up to. In future, I know that the Olaf regulation is being rethought somewhat at this moment. It is evolving, but decisions need to be taken about the future so that all of these strands can be brought together so that the EPPO can take on Olaf's added value. Administrative investigations are necessary, for example, when recovering money. Olaf can do that. The advantage is that Olaf has all that knowledge, all that know-how that the EPPO does not yet have. I'm assuming that in the future this interoperability will happen, but it needs to be improved so that the EPPO can constantly gain that information and that know-how from Olaf in order to make use of that added value and make use of that information, and in order to bring all of this to court, because that's the most important thing at the end of the day. It's bringing these matters to court and getting a decision, a judgment, and we need to go down that path jointly with Olaf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Over here. Clearly, Monsieur Bonner, you have extensive, as you say, experience in European cooperation in criminal matters. Now, my question is, how, because clearly this means a significant degree of diplomatic skill to bring together all these different elements of a European chief prosecutor. You referred also to the importance of being a technician, having a good knowledge of the technicalities. I feel something lacking. How can you prove that these qualities will make you more forceful as a prosecutor rather than inclined to find accommodations of one or another sort? In a sense, how can you prove us that you will be more bloody-minded, in a sense, in pursuing to the end cases and in a proper way, making it better than simply being aggressive?
Monsieur le député, un procureur ne doit...
Thank you. Well, a prosecutor must never be aggressive. But that said, they must be determined and show resolve. And I know that diplomacy has its limits. Being diplomatic means getting the information, getting a feel for situations, and understanding how the lie of the land. But sometimes that is as far as you get. A prosecutor in their jurisdiction, on their home turf, when there's a case which requires a decision, I take such decisions. In a past experience as a national prosecutor, I liked to surround myself by my deputies, particularly when this was a difficult decision. Now, you might say, no, he's hiding behind the coattails of his deputies, but I think that several heads are better than one. However, at the end of the day, once you have gathered in all the information, I took the decision. The buck stopped there. And I would not leave in the lurch any of my subordinates. It's for the head of the prosecution service to take the decisions. That's what they're appointed for, and they cannot duck the responsibility. Now, the head of the EPO, acting in an independent capacity, has nothing to fear from taking decisions. What do the texts say? What does the criminal code and in the particular case, what does it say? Are these offences, are these crimes? Do we have a sufficient body of proof and evidence against the alleged culprits? And that's when the decision is taken. I've done that for 32 years as a young prosecutor and now as a general prosecutor, and I can assure you that I was determined never to duck those responsibilities.
Frau Kollegin Makovej, bitte.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you very much indeed. If we look at the 2017 Olaf report, we can see that many fraud investigations involving European funds involved cases in Romania, 11, and then about a dozen in Poland and Hungary, and then there was Greece and Bulgaria as well. And then in smaller numbers, there are cases involving Germany, Italy, and other countries. So, given that context, my question is the following. The size of fraud, the dimensions of fraud involving European funds and European VAT is significant in Eastern and Central Europe. and it seems to be greater there than in other member states. And we can see that in the Olaf report. So what kind of experience do you have when it comes to combating this kind of crime, economic crime, which involves a political level as well, and which is practiced in certain member states, which, when you were involved with Eurojust, were actually previously not member states? Here I'm talking about Romania and Bulgaria.
Madame la députée, lorsque j'étais à Eurojust, c'était entre...
Well, between 2003-2007, I saw Romania and Bulgaria being taken into membership. And we worked together. There was a period just before then, minus Romania and Bulgaria. Now, there are certain arithmetical sides to the 2007 report, which give the numbers of cases, and that gives an assessment which is backed up by numbers, but it's not exhaustive. It's not exhaustive vis-à-vis the countries you mentioned. But also, when it comes to the longer established member states, such as my own, which would come into that category. But I can say, as the head prosecutor, the chief prosecutor of the EPPO, it would not be for me to judge a particular country in terms of the number of cases which were brought and which had to be handled. But we're not there to name and shame. That's not the purpose of the exercise. I know that in the longer established member states, particularly, well, including my own, there are things which need to be investigated. And on occasion, I have seen cases of corruption in in Bourgogne, no names, no pack drill, very nice wine. But this was a case of VAT fraud with Bourguignon vintners, and you see that there were kickbacks, money was changing hands, and people were falling off their seats because people were quite surprised. There was a feeling that it had been eradicated, but that is not necessarily the case. And I must say that I do have a very beady eye, and my experience may not be as extensive as other candidates. I have got my own track record, every prosecutor does. Mine was predominantly for 20 years in the European context, but I do have some experience which has helped me and has helped to enlighten me.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. Bonert, I don't think anybody here will doubt that you are an excellent procureur, as you say, but I think the question is, and that was also put a little bit by my S&D colleague, are you enough of a pit bull to do this job? Because this area of fraud with EU funds is, it's not just about fiddling the accounts, it's about hard-nosed criminals who are even willing to kill, as we have seen in 2 member states in a recent year and a half. And the problem here is that the governments are not necessarily your ally. The governments may actually be the ones that you have to investigate. And that is where the complications start. So it's a whole different ball game. And a second part of this question is, given that that is the case, will you rely solely on evidence provided by those member states, or will you also accept information provided by other sources? Thank you.
Oui, effectivement. La question...
Yes, yes, the determination of the prosecutor is a certainty when it's a matter of acting against member states. You're quite right, madam. But pitbull, using the term pitbull for the European prosecutor, I'm not so sure. I mean, I see what your intention is. Maybe the term goes a little bit too far, but it does represent this determination and this strength, the strength and determination to attack evil. And we, as magistrates of the Republic, do that when we're dealing with intermediate level crime. I mean, it's not the same kind of risk that we're taking. And there I do understand the risk that you are talking about. Of course, it's up to the chief prosecutor to be determined and to work in full independence. But these situations will arise perhaps sooner than we think, and at that time we need to look for allies. And in a democratic system, the allies include you, ladies and gentlemen. As I was saying before, the European prosecutor is accountable to you. But you, as representatives of the citizens of Europe, are here to support the work of the chief prosecutor, who comes to you and says, this is what we're facing up to. Then the prosecutor would need individual courage. I am courageous. I've never been afraid of anyone over 30 years in my career. I have no fear of taking on my responsibilities. I am certainly not afraid, and I am fully determined.
Jawohl, bitte.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bonner, to be here. You mentioned that I'm here. Yeah. So you mentioned in your introduction that the EPPO should convince the member states which didn't join the EPPO to join later on. Good luck for this, I wish you. Keeping in mind that, for example, the public prosecutor-in-chief of Hungary told that Hungary does not join EPPO because of the poor quality of EPPO, so you will have quite a difficult job. My questions are partly around the political pressure you personally may have from the governments, member state governments, and also your team and your prosecutors in the member states, where perhaps sometimes the political pressure is even more visible and tangible. How can you protect your own people, your own team? And the other question is that a little bit, if you can tell us about your experience on systemic corruption, systemic misuse of EU funds, which happens in a number of member states. Have you ever experienced this, and what are your plans to tackle this problem?
Monsieur le député, sur votre première question.
On your first question, I think the strength of the EPO is to actually be exemplary and show the way and how to work. But I don't think it's necessarily up to the EPO to do any political work vis-à-vis the non-participating member states. And it's not up to us to go and convince individually the member states, asking them to join us in the enhanced cooperation. That's not really my vision. I think there are other channels and fora for that work. But I think showing a good example and leading by example, and I saw this at Eurojust, because at the beginning people were very critical of us. They were very sceptical of our work, sceptical of colleagues, member states, the different institutions and so on. They were saying, you know, what is this thing? What's it going to lead to? And actually, in time, by leading by example and setting a good example, we actually proved that we did have the ability to take off and add value once we reached cruising speed. And I think that leading by example should actually be an incentive to the non-participating member states. But I think afterwards it's up to the political sphere in Europe to try to convince these member states to come into the fold. When it comes to the protection of the members of the prosecution office, well, that's another issue of the individual responsibility of the head of the EPO. We have to make sure that European prosecutors and those that perhaps are even more exposed, and here I'm thinking of the delegated European prosecutors because of their immersion in the system, they have to be protected from pressure, and that is done by having a very close contact between the head of the EPO and the European prosecutors, but also then meetings on a regular basis with all delegated European prosecutors to make sure that they have the opportunity to talk about pressure that they're under. And if there is that pressure, then the head of the EPO has to act immediately, intervene with the member state, and perhaps come here to the European Parliament to point the finger at a member state that isn't playing the game.
Madame la Présidente, merci.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Bonner, I think you'll have understood this afternoon that the whole issue of the independence of the EPPO, you go to the heart of the matter. It's central. You have a long, 32-year-long career in the prosecution service of France, in a country which is not known for the independence of its judiciary. And today that is a relative concept. Now, you've not been there for, you've been talking about a long span of time, but even now, if you look at the repression of the Gilets jaunes, you can see that the prosecutor is really beholden to the political authorities. My question, two questions really. Can you tell us, over 32 years of a career, have you never been subjected to pressure from the political powers that be? Secondly, in those 32 years of a career, in many prosecution services across France, have there been major cases which have been in the newspapers and which have been emblematic of corruption and which have gone into the political, financial world? And can you give us an idea of the cases which you have led against the culprits in major cases like that, which have been in all the newspapers?
L'indépendance du ministère public.
Thank you for your question. The independence of our role in France has evolved. There have been situations in the past that I didn't live through personally. I've not been under that kind of pressure personally. I'm talking about what I've observed as an outsider, and it's true that there have been situations where the Ministry of Justice took or gave instructors to the national prosecutor. Now, this situation, and I say this emphatically, has changed radically since 2013. A law has been passed banning those instructions. Let me give you an example of what's happened since 2013. There was a case, I remember, where my job was to seek counsel from a criminal directorate under the Ministry of Justice, under direct orders from the Minister of Justice. That directorate, this was 2014-2015, just after this law was passed, that directorate did not wish to respond out of fear that those instructions may be interpreted as the beginnings of instructions given to myself. At the end of the day, that expertise that I was seeking was not given to me. But that's just to illustrate the situation. Young prosecutors now live within this new law. This is the Medieff versus France case and the consequences thereof. Of course, we have not yet completed this exercise. We still have to go through further constitutional reforms, but on major corruption cases, there's one I was dealing with under judicial cooperation between France and Germany. I don't know whether I've got time to explain that case here. I think it was in the answer to question number 3. Thank you to Budget Control. Thank you. It's very interesting, and good luck.
Monsieur Bonner, I'd like to thank you on behalf of all members for your participation in the hearing. Thank you again to members for all your patience and discipline. These are quite, once we get down to it, are quite long processes. Thank you very much for your patience. I want to just inform you, Monsieur Bonner, that we will have a full evaluation of the hearing. We will write formally, of course, to President Tajani and formally, and then you will be informed. But again, thank you for your time and participation in the hearing. It's much appreciated.
May I add something? It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, we're nearly there. We will now have our third candidate. I know it's a very long process. Thank you again for all your resilience. It's been a long day, I know. Yeah, our third candidate is on her way, so please maintain your discipline out of respect for the final candidate, and we will see her shortly. Thank you.
Many thanks.
Here, colleagues, if you want to... I was going to say if you want to take a break, but I think our candidate is on our way, so just a couple of minutes. Dear colleagues, please take your seats. Could I just say, just out of respect for all of the candidates, can you just minimise the amount of movement in the room? And may I just say, please respectfully to the press as well. I mean, take some pictures, but within reason, please. I guess I know the press is very special, but can you just listen to me and allow us to begin? Thank you. If you allow us to begin, and out of respect for the candidate, because the candidate will have to speak. So maybe if you could move to the side now. I think you've got enough pictures. It's okay. Thank you. That's all of you. Thanks. Please move out of the way. Thank you. If our WCAs could help me, thanks. Okay, colleagues, and also please minimise. Can I just mention to colleagues, just minimise the movement in the room, just out of respect for all of the candidates, because on the first candidate there was a lot of movement at the beginning. It's not fair on them. Okay, so we come to our third candidate, Mrs. Kovesi. I'm going to repeat all of the same introduction as we did for all of the candidates. We welcome Mrs. Kovesi to the LIBE meeting. If I give you again the information for her benefit, the candidate is invited to make an opening oral statement of no more than 7 minutes. And of course we will time the opening statement and we will time the questions and answers. The timer is here, please. Just this is the screen and you'll see the screen here, and also there's a timer here which will go on and off. After the introduction there will be time for a question and answer session of a total of 63 minutes. We'll ask 14 questions from LIBE members, 7 from the CONT committee members. Each question and answer slot will be 3 minutes, so the members will ask 1 minute question and there will be 2 minutes answer. But we will strictly adhere to the timing on this, colleagues. Please be aware that we will be strict in our speaking time requests. Interpretation is provided, so you can use your own language, keeping in mind what you say needs to be interpreted, so please don't speak too quickly. So, with this information, Ms. Kovesi, can I ask you for your presentation, please? I give you the floor for up to 7 minutes, please.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity to present my candidacy. For the beginning, I will speak in English when I will make my introductory statement. But after that, because there are a lot of my colleagues and a lot of Romanians that are watching on these hearings, I will speak Romanian. So I will start to present myself. I'm Laura Kovesi. I have been a prosecutor for over 23 years old. So half of my life, I have been a prosecutor. My job is to make justice work when the criminal law is broken. I have held the highest position in the Romanian prosecutor public service, General Prosecutor of Romania for 6 years, and Chief Prosecutor of National Anti-Corruption Directorate, known as DNA, for 5 years. DNA is the only specialized structure with exclusive jurisdiction to investigate high-level corruption cases and also financial frauds and fraud against EU funds. Setting up an independent and efficient European Public Prosecutor's Office is a unique professional opportunity. I would be honored to continue the work of so many people, politicians, practitioners, and civil servants who turn an idea into a legal text. Now we need the efforts to make EPPO efficient. So I will present very briefly my vision about EPPO. EPPO must protect the EU financial interests, recover damages, and contribute to the enforcement of rule of law in EU. What needs to be done for that? First of all, prepare the infrastructure, human and financial one, set up a case management system in cooperation with the member states, define internal rules, and adopt all the necessary administrative rules, especially when we speak regarding the data protection, human resources, and financial rules. For the prosecutors to be able to work efficiently, we must define targets and prosecution strategies with the College of the European Prosecutors, establish process to monitor the implementation of the strategies, share information, and agree on priorities with national authorities, establish enhanced cooperation treaties with non-participating member states, and cooperation with the third states. Define service level agreements with Eurojust, Europol, OLAF, and financial investigation units, create a strategic analysis working group to identify the typologies, risks, and vulnerabilities in the existing legal framework and procedures. How can I contribute to this? By leading by example. I have extensive experience in managing large teams, taking strategic decisions, issuing internal rules and guidelines. I'm used to dealing with public pressure and working under stressful situations. Together with my team, I increased the efficiency of the investigations of high-level corruption and fraud against EU funds. The assets recovering has been my main focus. During my mandate, DNA seized assets amounting to over 2 billion euros. I created a structure for financial investigations. As a result, the amount of recovered assets increased to at least 300 million euros per year, 10 times higher than the previous period. We developed strong international partnerships. We set up joint investigations teams. We developed judicial assistance and common operation in more than 40 countries. This is how we seize properties and banking accounts in other countries. We also identify different typologies of committing financial fraud, and that this can help me take strategic measures. These are my professional achievements, building on my experience. What are the principles that guide my activity? I will tell you very briefly. I believe that a prosecutor must aim for the truth, must be a servant of the rule of law, and must have a strong moral compass. We must remain objective. In the face of injustice and crime, we may apply the law and fully respect the procedural and fundamental rights of the persons involved in the investigations. This is why prosecutors matter for the rule of law. We matter because it is our duty to apply the law equally for everybody. This is all the prosecutors in the European Union have in common. This is what Giovanni Falcone and Pierre Michel stood for. I also believe that only a professional, independent, and honest judiciary could efficiently fight against serious crime as corruption or financial fraud. The independence of the judiciary is not a privilege for prosecutors or judges. Only an independent judiciary can enforce the law equally for everybody. Also, I strongly believe that independence and accountability can only work together. On the other hand, I am aware that you have been exposed to a lot of negative information about me. I would like to say very clearly that I have absolutely nothing to hide, so I will be available to answer to all your questions today. Honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, this Parliament has fought for a strong EPPO with a solid base in the PIF directive and framed by procedural rights across the EU. This Parliament is defending the rule of law and fundamental rights. Because of that, the European citizens' money will be well protected. Thank you once again for the opportunity to present my candidacy, and also I would like to thank you for the possibility to participate to an open and impartial hearings.
Thank you, Ms. Kovesi. We now move to the questions, and we begin with Roberta Metsola for the EPP.
Thank you, Ms. Kovesi, for coming here today, in spite of every imaginable obstacle put in your way. We know just how hard it is, and your dignified courage in the face of such an onslaught has inspired people not only in Romania but across our continent. Now, as a prosecutor, you have been the face of the anti-corruption movement in your country. Can you tell us more about your experience on high-profile cases facing public and media attention? What is your experience with working with Olaf? How do you see the EPPO working with that and other agencies? Now, as you know, the EPPO will have to deal with some of the toughest, even politically charged cases. We have seen instances around Europe where national prosecution or law enforcement authorities either refuse to take action or refuse to investigate, let alone prosecute clear criminal offences. How would you deal with non-cooperative member states in this regard?
So, Ms. Kovesi, that was a very long question, so just to say to you, it's always 2 minutes, though. It's for all candidates. Thank you.
On the issue of heavily mediatised cases, I can be very brief. Nearly all of the cases that I investigated at the DNA were of interest with regard to the people who were being investigated, because the powers of the DNA were all about high-level corruption investigation. So we investigated people who were in public positions, mayors, county presidents, senators, members of parliament, ministers, former ministers, and obviously citizens wanted to know why they were being investigated. And each time, public communication was always carried out with respect for the principle of the burden of proof in order to try to protect the people who were in public roles. And we always communicated in accordance with the laws and the rules set out by the Supreme Council of the Magistracy. And when it comes to the Olaf experience that I had as a DNA prosecutor, I worked closely with this European structure, and the EPO regulation is very clear when it comes to collaboration with Olaf in the future. There's going to be close cooperation between the two, and there is also an obligation to exchange information using the case management system. And there's also a provision which stipulates that when the EPO is starting an investigation, Olaf will not start its own administrative investigation in parallel. When it comes to cooperation with the authorities of the member states, I'd just like to say that this is also set out and provided for by the regulation. There will be continuous consultation on issues pertaining to the EPO's powers and also with regard to all of the work being done by the delegated prosecutors or European prosecutors.
Thank you. And Sylvia von Kaufmann for the S&D, please, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Ms. Kovesi, and thank you very much for being here and for your introductory statement. I would like to ask the following question. Could you please explain in which way you fulfill with all the requirements needed for the position of the Chief Prosecutor of EPO as listed under Article 14 of the regulation, especially that your independence is beyond doubt and that you possess the qualifications required for appointment to the highest prosecutorial or judicial offices in their respective member states? Thank you.
Vă mulțumesc pentru.
Thank you very much indeed for that question and for the opportunity to clarify some information that's been circulating. When I submitted my candidacy, I checked all of the criteria which are set out, and I am able to meet all of them. When it comes to my professional seniority, I can say that with regard to Article 14 of Law 200/2004, which sets out the requirements for a prosecutor, are actually met. There are 4 conditions. First of all, you have to have a seniority of more than 10 years. I have that. You mustn't have cooperated or collaborated with intelligence services, and there are declarations made by magistrates on that. And you must not have been subject to disciplinary measures over the last 3 years. And you also need to have high qualifications and assessment at the most recent professional appraisal. I meet these criteria. I was actually appointed a general prosecutor and chief prosecutor at the DNA in accordance with all of the legal requirements, and I have the necessary seniority to become a prosecutor at the High Court of Cassation and Justice. When it comes to the cooperation with services, the law says that you mustn't have been a collaborator in terms of a political collaborator, but it doesn't talk about institutional collaboration, which you might need to undertake in your work as a prosecutor.
Thank you. Helga Stevens for the ECR, please.
Dank u wel, voorzitter, collega's.
Thank you very much, Chair, colleagues. The EPO is going to be conducting cross-border investigations involving community funds or VAT, and in Romania, for example, it would be possible to investigate alleged fraud there as well. What concerns would you have there which would need to be investigated? Secondly, the complex relationship between the Ministry of Justice at EU level and the Member States, the EPO and the Member States. In cross-border cases, embarking on investigations, there may well be political reasons which would deter them from intervening. There may well be political pressure. What would your reaction be in the event of political pressure of that kind being exerted?
In all of my undertakings as a prosecutor in over 23 years, I've always respected the law and all of the procedural criminal provisions set out in the special legislation that we applied. Like any other prosecutor, we have to be objective in the work that we do and conduct ourselves with passion but not mercy. And as such, I think if I were to be given this opportunity, as I have in the past, I will always act in a professional way and also respect the obligations that are set out in the regulation for the EPO and in other rules. For me, it is not important what has happened in Romania. and it's not important what is happening between the prosecution service and the justice ministry. At European level, if I were to be given this opportunity, I would always respect the EPO regulation if I were appointed to this role.
Sophie Intervelt for ALDE, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madam Kovesi, for your introduction. I would like to further elaborate a little bit on the question of my colleague, Mrs. Stevens. How would you specifically use the newly created Eurojust national correspondence network for the EPO to ensure that non-participating member states not only don't hinder the work of EPO, but are also convinced to join? And secondly, and also looking at your specific CV, how will you ensure that with its particular structure, with the national agents, that EPO is going to be a truly European office and will not be held back by the member states?
Este adevărat.
It is true that European prosecutors who are delegated will continue to be prosecutors in their national systems, and each of the national systems has a certain relationship with the executive power. However, cross-border investigations have been carried out in the past, and a very efficient way of concluding these cross-border investigations has been to use common or joint investigation teams through Eurojust, which is a very efficient cooperation tool. This has been the case in the past, but also when the EPO regulation applies, then Eurojust will be expected to work very closely with EPO, but that is set out in the regulation very clearly. There will be an exchange of information which is highly necessary. There will also be informational support, but there will also be the possibility of using delegated national agents or contact points, which are very important when it comes to dealing with the member states who are not participating in the EPO system. When it comes to the non-participating member states, I think it's up to the head prosecutor of the EPO to try to strike certain agreements on cooperation, and this is set out again in the regulation, and try to establish points of contact. And I think the way in which the non-participating member states could be induced to sign up to these agreements or even join the EPO it will actually be determined by the success rate of the EPO. I think people need to be convinced that the EPO is a structure that can work and that is efficient and effective and that works in the interests of all with regard to protecting European citizens' money.
Thank you. Eva Joly for the Greens, please.
Thank you, President. I wanted to say to Laura Kovesi and to all of you how proud I am that she is here today in spite of the terrible campaign that her government has started against her. And I want to say that we don't believe what is said. We don't believe. And I personally have special reasons not to believe, because I know what's happening when you jail important person or you conduct inquiries into the circles of power. So please do not take that into account. And then I want to ask Laura Kovesi, what kind of measures would you take to ensure the fundamental rights of the future suspects if you have the position of the EPO here in the Parliament?
One of the fundamental principles underpinning the EPO is the one on the respect for fundamental rights of the people who are involved in investigations. So undoubtedly this will be a priority for anybody involved in the EPO work. I can also say that as general prosecutor or as chief prosecutor at the DNA, there were many situations where I could see that prosecutors working underneath me were corrected in the work that they were doing if there were breaches of the rights of suspects. Now, in a situation, if this kind of incidents were to appear in EPO, if there were a European prosecutor that had breached these fundamental rights, then measures would have to be taken. And then the next step would be to disseminate that information to all of the other investigating prosecutors at the EPO to make sure that we would be able to avoid this kind of situation occurring in the future. But what's very important to say here is that in Romania, the activity of the prosecutors is strictly controlled by the judges, and the way in which they work and the way they deal with evidence and the dossiers is dealt with and supervised by the judges. And as general prosecutor and the head of the DNA, I always checked what was happening with the judges. If there were questions regarding evidence, for example, or if evidence was deemed to be illegal by a judge, then we would analyze that, and that information would then be disseminated to the internal structure in order to avoid this situation occurring again in the future.
For GUI.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kovesi, I'm over here. I wanted to express my full support and solidarity in the face of the attacks which you have received. And I was very struck by the fact that you mentioned Giovanni Falcone, because I had very close relations of collaboration with him in the past. Now, having said that, can I ask for one clarification? In your replies to the questions, you mention 2 special awards which you received from the CIA in 2011 and in 2007, acknowledgement of outstanding support for the US law enforcement authorities. And can I have clarification on that? What exactly was that acknowledgement for? Because there was no indication of what exactly that was. That was in 2007 and also in 2011. And between 2003 and 2005, there was the whole question of the CIA and in Romania.
Vă mulțumesc pentru întrebare.
Thank you very much indeed for the question. I'd just like to make one correction there. These are not awards that were offered by the CIA, but these were awards that were offered by an agency responsible for applying the law, the Secret Service Agency. There are 2 responsibilities held by that agency. First of all, to protect the physical security and safety of US nationals, but also to protect their national currency, the dollar. And in my role as prosecutor in the DNA, I investigated many cases involving fake bank notes, counterfeit notes, particularly dollars, but also in particular we were involved with cases of cybercrime. And I was one of the first prosecutors in Romania investigating illegal fishing cases in Romania. In Romania, cybercrime has been a very real problem and still is. There are many Romanian citizens involved in this kind of activity. With regard to my involvement in the vocational training and the development of possibilities for prosecutors to investigate these cybercrime cases. As a result of that work, I was given these 2 awards by the American Secret Service. At the beginning of my work as Prosecutor General in 2006 and 2007, the structures for applying the law in Romania were dealing with this form of IT crime for the first time, and that is why we needed to develop and carry out professional training sessions for the prosecutors, and that is how I was involved in this work. And for that work, I was given these two distinctions. I didn't get American citizenship through that, and there was no CIA cooperation involved, even though I know that there's been a lot of news about this. Unfortunately, it's all lies.
Mr. Ivan for the non-attached.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Mrs. Kovesi, here in the European Parliament and in these two committees in particular, we talk about very important values such as the independence of the judiciary, zero tolerance with regard to corruption, the right to express an opinion and the right to freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, professionalism, integrity, moral probity, and so on and so forth. And also, the European Council set out recommendations that the secret services shouldn't be involved in criminal proceedings. So those are just observations, but there are a couple of things that I think are very important here, particularly for people who are taking decisions in this room. First question is the following. Is it true that the CSM, the Superior Council of the Magistracy, has noted that the DNA that you were in charge of influenced the conduct of a case that affected you directly? Secondly, is it true that Romanian intelligence services were part of joint teams addressing the evidence that you were involved in investing cases for? And then how do you explain that 4% of prosecutors actually ended up with cases of acquittal? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for those questions. In 2 minutes, I will try to give you a complete answer and clarifications. There was a process targeting a number of false allegations made, and this whole case carried on for about 4 years. And after that, there was a final definitive decision taken that the affirmations were actually lies and it was not true. I'm going to restate that this took 4 years, this case. I won in the first court of instance, and there were many judges involved in that case, and at no point was I involved in any kind of influencing. Everything was made public. There were many instances that found in favor of me and at different levels. Now, if the CSM believes that a judge was influenced, then there was actually a report carried out by the Judicial Inspectorate which says that the judges involved in this case have come out and said that they were not influenced in any way by me. And the report that I believe you're referring to is actually now being attacked at the High Court of Cassation and Justice, and there isn't a final decision issued on that yet. And there are also other issues pertaining to that regarding other colleagues from the DNA. And also, there was nothing, I had nothing directly to do with that. With regard to your second question, I'd like to correct the declaration you made. The secret services didn't offer evidence. They were not involved in the criminal process. There were certain referrals that were made involving the secret services, and that is provided for by the law. But any information service in Romania and any other information body that has information on corruption is actually obliged to cooperate with the DNA. So it wasn't about them providing evidence, but the evidence was requested by the prosecutors and then verified by the administration.
You are keeping to time, but we have to do it for all candidates.
I have one more question, one very big, if possible.
There's a short question if you would like to answer. 10 seconds.
I mean, you've been under time for everything, so I don't see that there's a problem if you just want to quickly say it for 10 seconds.
With regard the 40% acquittal rate, that's not true. Every year the acquittal rate is published on the site of the institution. It was between 10 and 13%. You're probably referring to the last activity report that was published this week, and there was an acquittal rate of 36% of acquittals. But for 6 months, I haven't been part of the DNA, but I did read that activity report, and the real rate of acquittals is actually 13.6%, and that's a difference between that and 36%, because you have to also look at acquittals regarding certain cases for abuse of office. So 13% of acquittals were for other reasons, and more than 20% of people who were acquitted are within the 3% band, and that's because of the decriminalisation of the acts they were alleged of committing.
But please forgive me if I've breached the rules there, but I do use my discretion. Okay, for the next EPP question, I have 3 names: Mr. Engel, Mr. Nguarno, or Mr. Radev. Which one is it? Mr. Nguarno, is it you? Please go ahead.
Is this me, Chair?
Well, I have 3 names indicated.
I have only 1 name. Okay.
No, who is it? Who out of the 3? Mr. Nguarno, you go. For the EPP, it's you.
This time it's me. Okay. Bună ziua, doamna.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Kovesi, and thank you very much for your presentation. I have to ask you a question that we've heard many times, but I must persist with this. There might be problems with regard to the delegated European prosecutors in the future and how they work, and Romania will be proposing at least 2 people for that particular role. So you mentioned this in the written responses you submitted. There could be problems in terms of principle here with regard to, this double subordination and the possibility of there being contradictory instructions issued. The second issue here is that there's an extraordinary but very real situation with regard to Romania, whereby the government that is going to be making the proposals for the delegated prosecutors is openly hostile. So my question is the following: how are you going to resolve that problem in terms of the work that you do and the image that you portray? Are you going to basically use internal proceedings or procedure that you're going to have to draft yourself? Is that going to be enough, or is there going to have to be another layer of procedure here? How are you going to resolve this, or at least try to limit the problems that could arise from these 2 issues? Thank you very much indeed for the question. And thanks for repeating this question, because that gives me an opportunity to give more explanations in the little time that I have. So I'll try to be brief. When it comes to the activities of the delegated prosecutors, the instructions for criminal cases will always be given by the permanent chambers. And there you can have prosecutors and the chief prosecutor, but also deputy prosecutors or a high-level prosecutor, European prosecutor, designated by the chef. And there will be a head prosecutor, and there will be a random distribution of cases across the chambers. So when it comes to the delegated European prosecutors that are going to be working with the EPO, there will always have to be that will always have to be borne in mind in terms of what is happening in the permanent chambers. There was also going to be collaboration between the EPO and national authorities, and that is clearly set out in the regulation, and I think that's also very important. It's true that the government is hostile to this, particularly with regard to me, but it shouldn't be hostile with regard to a European institution where there won't just be 2 or 3 prosecutors from Romania. The rules are extremely clear with regard to the relationship between the authorities in the member states and the EPO. And there will be an internal regulation which is going to be adopted. I can't give a lot of detail about that now because, as is the norm, this will be adopted in the Council of European Prosecutors with a 2/3 majority. So it obviously has to be discussed and shaped by the debates with the other European prosecutors and national authorities, but undoubtedly these aspects will have to be looked at in time. So irrespective of how friendly or hostile a government is, as a prosecutor you've got to do your job and respect the obligations that are set out in the regulation and that apply to in the legislation.
Maria Grappini for the S&D, please.
Mulțumesc mult.
Thanks very much indeed. The relationship between the executive power and prosecutorial services is different in different member states. So how are you going to promote the proactive role of delegated prosecutors when it comes to investigating PIF crimes at national level in an equal way across the member states? Mrs. Kovesi, because you were not precise when you talked about this earlier. The CSM has given you an answer with regard to your seniority. How can you explain this problem of your seniority, and how can you get round the issue of abuse of office and lies? Because, you know, this is a problem for your candidacy. You were constitutionally dismissed from your role as chief prosecutor at the DNA. How do you explain that?
Mulțumesc.
Just up until now, there hasn't been any of these kind of exchanges, so just keep it like that. Just keep it like that for the sake of the candidate. Now, please answer. Just 1 second. There's going to be no exchanges like that. All the other two candidates had the respect of the committee. So if you want to respect the candidate, just don't do that. Please go ahead, Ms. Kovesi.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you very much indeed. The active role of the European prosecutor and delegated prosecutors is going to be carried out in accordance with the priorities and strategies which are set out in the Council of European Prosecutors and in conformity with internal rules which are going to be set out also by the Council. When it comes to seniority, I'm not aware of what the CSM has said, but I can say that there is a provision set out by the law, and that is nothing to do with your professional seniority. In similar situations, the other deputies who have been prosecutor generals, as well as other colleagues who've been under my authority, received their professional seniority through the CSM or through the Judicial Inspectorate. I'm the only person who's been refused that request, and there were other 7 cases where the CSM granted this right, and I'm the only one who hasn't been granted it. But it is not actually a requirement set out in the law. I was nominated as the head of the DNA and general prosecutor without having that professional seniority. Now, when it comes to revoking the powers I had as DNA prosecutor, this was as a result of a decision by the Constitutional Court. I was nothing to do with that process. The court handed down a ruling which was in conflict with the president of Romania and the government. I wasn't actually asked to be involved in that procedure. I didn't have an opportunity to defend myself, and I didn't have an opportunity to appeal either. And for that reason, I sent a complaint to the European Court of Human Rights, and that is being looked at the moment, and we'll have to wait and see what they rule. But this complaint is actually about principles here. If prosecutors in Romania are going to be independent or not, and if you can suddenly dismiss a prosecutor, we have to wonder whether or not that's something that could be done by the Constitutional Court.
Monica McAvey for the ECR.
Mulțumesc. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry that the questions being put by the majority of colleagues have not been about what you might do for EPO, but rather about allegations made against you. And that's, using up precious time. But I have 2 questions. What is your experience with regard to high-level corruption and fraud cases? You said that this is something the DNA was involved with. Can you perhaps give us a figure or something for definitive convictions? And then second question. Your practice did generate political pressure, and we know that in Romania and in Eastern Europe there are political pressures. So, next question. When it comes to European fund fraud, this is principally a problem in Eastern Europe, and there are cases involving fraud worth hundreds of millions of euro in that region. I'm not going to name the particular cases pertaining to Romania, but we're talking about systemic corruption and political influence being brought to bear. So perhaps you can set out your experience in this kind of fraud and dealing with that systemic fraud, and perhaps give us some concrete examples of the work that you've done in that field. Thank you.
Foarte scurt, în ceea ce...
Well, very briefly, when it comes to the criminal case, I have to say that I was innocent. I am innocent. This is about a number of allegations that are made to try to involving the extradition of a person from another country, and I can give you more details on that if you want it. First question then, with regard to definitive convictions and political pressure that was brought to bear, I can say that every year the DNA was prosecuting about 1,000 culprits, and a high number of them, about 900 of them annually, were being convicted. And over the 5 years as DNA chief, there were more than 60 high-ranking officials, ministers, former ministers, members of parliament, secretaries of state, and senators. When it comes to political pressures being brought to bear, as prosecutor, chief prosecutor at the DNA, and also as general prosecutor, I would say that if a politician wanted to intervene in a case, then I would always make that public. That was a preventive measure, in my view, that was very effective, because then people didn't ask me to intervene. And there were a number of cases where people who were important figures in Romania were investigated, and obviously there were external pressures brought to bear, but every time that happened, we faced the pressures head-on, and that was successful. When it comes to EU funds fraud, it's very important for me to tell you that every year the DNA was dealing with more than 2,000 cases of this kind. We looked at the Olaf report from 2017 and previous years, and Olaf was involved in about 200 cases annually. So maybe it's an inappropriate comparison, but I want to show you that investigating that many cases means that you become very familiar with this kind of crime, particularly when it comes to the use of European funds for something other than what they were disbursed for, or the use of fake documents or incomplete documents to try to get these funds, or when it comes to fraud and corruption in the terms of using these funds. Now, we know what kind of typologies are involved here. We know what these crimes involved. Speaker is cut off.
It's fine, but we need to, because we've been strict with all the candidates. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're sort of losing our time discipline everywhere. But okay, now Mr. Mamikins, Andres Mamikins for the S&D, the final Libe speaker.
Thank you very much, Chair, honourable candidate. My question is: have you dealt with complex transnational investigations, specifically in a supranational body requiring coordination, negotiations, or settling potential jurisdictional conflicts between the national judicial authorities involved? What do you consider to be the added value of the EPPO, and how would you envisage demonstrating this added value to those member states which are currently not part of the EPPO, in order to encourage them to also opt in at a later stage? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the DNA, the Anti-Corruption Directorate, did deal with many cross-border cases. As I said, we had joint cooperation teams and common operations when it came to asking for judicial assistance. And I can say that for a 12-month period in 2017, we had about 18 requests for judicial assistance sent in by other member states. And here we were able to confiscate and seize properties in other member states, or indeed freeze bank accounts. And each time there were conflicts in terms of the jurisdiction, and we tried to resolve those conflicts in accordance with the Judicial Assistance Conventions. And when it comes to the EPO, there is a provision according to which all of the evidence that are administered by a territory or another member state needs to be administered according to the legislation of that member state. So the added value of the EPO comes into play just here. There is an exchange of information, and there is a single approach at European level. This is the first time we have an opportunity to create a prosecution structure that will be able to carry out investigations into fraud using European funds, and we will be able to have a single and consistent, coherent approach to those investigations. The second advantage is that there will be an administration of evidence in the member states in question, particularly with regard to cross-border cases, and we will also have quick exchange of information as well. Another advantage of the EPO, to my mind, is that if we look at the different typologies, the different kinds of cases we're dealing with, we will be quickly able to identify risks and vulnerabilities in the procedures that are used to disperse European funds. And I think it's very true that fraud with European funds is not something that should just be investigated, but also prevented. And this kind of analysis, the results from the cases we've looked at, would obviously be of great use.
Ja, vielen Dank. I will speak German. Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. From the Budget Control Committee, we know you very well. You have given us a sense of confidence in the Romanian system and have embarked on inquiries and investigations. I think that all the candidates today have been very qualified. But I think that you have demonstrated this in very practical terms. And I regret the way the questions have been put this afternoon, because we have worked with you closely in this very important area in Romania in the past. Now, when it comes to administrative investigations by OLAF, once the EPO is up and running, will OLAF need to change? I'm rapporteur for the OLAF regulation, and I'd be very interested to know where OLAF is headed once EPO is in place.
Well, as I said, I collaborated closely with OLAF, and the role of the administrative investigations was all about providing a first step in the criminal investigation that the prosecutors were involved in. But all of these administrative reports, at least with regard to the investigations that I was involved in, were completed then with administrative evidence in the criminal procedure for both those who were accused and other culprits involved. When it comes to cooperation with OLAF, this cooperation, I think, should be limited to an exchange of information, and I think it's very important that the investigations carried out by the EPO should not then be duplicated with administrative investigations at OLAF. I think the priority, and this is set out in the regulation, should be for the EPP to act. When they open an investigation, then if that happens, then OLAF cannot in parallel organise an administrative investigation. OLAF can, however, help in combating fraud with European funds and continued the work that it does with regard to fraud which is identified in the member states that are not participating in the EPO.
Dankeschön. Frau Kollegin Ayala Sender, bitte.
Yes, I'm over here. Thank you very much, Ms. Kovesi. Well, I too think it's regrettable that you have to complain about the pressure. I could tell you about pressure on prosecutors in Spain, in Catalonia, because by their very nature, prosecutors are subject to this pressure and have to maintain their independence. On your CV, I see that you've done a lot in 2017. You got a medal from the Hans Heidel Foundation, which is a CSU foundation. And before your hearing, we heard declarations from EPP colleagues clearly in favour before having heard you. So this doesn't make life easy for you. So how are you going to affirm your independence given these circumstances? Other groups might think that that goes hand in hand with you. And secondly, how will you cooperate with other European prosecutors within the EPO, the national prosecutors, whereas I see on your CV that you've been working mainly in Romania, Moldova and Montenegro. Could you answer in English? We have fine interpreters that can interpret into Romanian.
voi apăra independența.
I will be defending independence on the back or the strength of the results that I've achieved so far.
Thank you very much. Yes.
No, Mrs. Kovesi, you are entitled to speak the language you want to speak.
I don't know if I will finish in 2 minutes, but I will answer to them. In all my activity, all the time, I was independent. I respected the legislation all the time. My results are speaking for me, because in our activity with my colleagues, we investigated the members of the different parties, not all the members from one party. And also in our activity, we investigated people that they have wealth, they have important position, but because we were independent in our activity, we all the time finalized these cases. It's very important to say today that the independence was provided by law. And in this moment, there are attempts to limit our independence. In my view, one of the premises for investigating corruption to high level or to investigate European financial frauds with European funds, it's very important to be independent. Regarding the last question, how I will cooperate with the other European prosecutors. I already said that we worked with our colleagues from 40 member states, and not only. Yes, I was an expert for the European Commission in Montenegro, in Moldova, because they need our experience, and because as a result of our activity, me and my colleague were invited to be expert and to analyze their legislation specially. And also we work together with our colleagues in some professional trainings. You know, I'm a human. Maybe I'm not perfect, but I was nervous today because it's a very important day for me and for my colleagues. And this is the reason why it's very easy for me to speak my language. I know English, I can speak English. I know also French. And if it's important for you, I can speak with you only in English. But please understood that for me and for my colleagues, it's a very important day. Thank you.
Frau Kollegin Makovej, bitte.
Mulțumesc. The people are talking.
Monica has the floor.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you. I would like to continue with the question that I put when I was speaking as a member of the LIBE committee, and now I'm speaking as a member of the CONT committee. You were talking about the fact that you know the kind of familiar hallmarks of fraud cases, but I'd like to know if you can tell us a little bit more about that, the typical hallmarks of fraud cases. Then perhaps you could give us some examples with regard to the way in which Olaf will continue its work on irregularities, because not all irregularities are cases of fraud. And I'm kind of taking up the question from Mrs. Gressler here. Will Olaf continue to be able to work on irregularity cases? Thank you. Thank you. When it comes to the typical hallmarks of fraud cases, well, for the most common cases, the hallmarks are really about the way in which European funds are used for purposes other than those for which they were granted, or the use of fake or incomplete documents to obtain European funds in the first place, and then corruption with regard to European funds. There were many situations of this type in Romania, There were also situations where certain specialized companies specializing in creating documentation for requesting European funding actually asked for money to set up these documents, and there were even situations where public officials were receiving bribes or other benefits in order to trigger procedures to apply for more European funds. And then there are other situations with regard to public tenders and the use or procurement using European funds. There were certain firms benefiting from European funds, which then financed intermediary companies to create constrictive or limited or constrictive conditions for other companies to prevent them from getting European funds. Now, with regard to Olaf, it's true that not all the Olaf cases are about fraud, but there are also Olaf cases which involve just irregularities that have been identified. And according to the regulation for the EPO here, then EPO will have to introduce a referral to Olaf and be in touch with the national competent authorities as well.
Frau Kollegin Griesbeck, bitte.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would like perhaps to get away from this important debate about difficulties and, for that matter, the tribulations of respecting the principle of independence, and come back to the EPPO as such. My group has always been very much in favour of effective EU instruments, particularly for the EPPO. It's going to have a kind of a hybrid structure, a bit centralised, a bit decentralised. How would you characterise the functioning of that when it comes to exchanging information and the smooth functioning under those two dimensions, two facets of the future EPPO?
Well, that's going to be a challenge for the Chief Prosecutor at European level to make sure the EPO works as one single team. I'm used to this kind of thing because the DNA also has a central structure and then a local structure, and the regulation for the EPO also offers advantages to the Chief Prosecutor because you have the permanent chambers and then you have the delegated European Prosecutor, which will be the link between the central structure and then the delegated European prosecutors. I think the issue really here is communication. That's going to be very important, but you're going to have to also create internal rules that will have to be adopted together with the Council for European Prosecutors. And in addition, we'll have to develop a communication system which is very swift. In the EPO regulation, you have the case management system which will be in place and will offer us the possibility to know at any point which cases are being dealt with and what discussions need to be had with which prosecutors. And that's important for the link between the permanent chambers and the European delegated prosecutors. When it comes to the exchange of information, this can be done very quickly within the institution, and this is one of the advantages of the EPO. And the decisions taken by the permanent chamber on, for example, commencing proceedings on a case are just 3 days. That's the deadline for that kind of decision, so it's very quick.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Kovesi, to come today to us. It's, again, good to see you again. I would like to come back to the issue which was raised by Ms. McAway, and that's the fact that most of the European funds are spent in the eastern member states and parts of the southern member states. You are the only candidate coming from the region, and as you've proven before, you have a vast experience in how to tackle the systemic way of corruption which is sometimes occurs in some Eastern member states, and what can we do when political networks or governments or mafia groups are occupying European funds? And how do you plan to implement this experience from your background into the activity of the EPPO? How do you believe that EPPO can be much more effective in this than the existing European institutions?
Well, I don't think we necessarily need to have preconceived ideas. If I were to be head of the EPO, and if there is in one country more fraud than in others, that's, you know, one thing that statistics can tell us, but that doesn't mean levels of undiscovered crime are not relevant. I can say that investigating more than 2,000 cases of EU funding fraud per year means that I know these cases very well. But there are different judicial systems and organizational systems. That's true across the member states. But the way in which people defraud the EU funds is very much the same. So the idea of the EPO is to kind of create strategies which prioritize the cases to deal with. And then, if there is a high level of EU funding fraud in certain countries, and you were mentioning Eastern European countries, and if you look at the Olaf report, you can see what has been happening there with regard to what's been discovered by that European institution. But the figures show us that sometimes EU funding fraud can become systemic, and that is why one of the priorities of the new EPO chief is not just to investigate complex cases involving hundreds of millions of euros and VAT fraud, but also it's important to identify those zones where European fraud, even if they involve small sums, is repetitive and systemic, and if there is a risk of it becoming systemic. And from that perspective, I think what the DNA has been doing over the last 5 years, and if you look at the results that we've achieved there, that's very relevant when it comes to European funding fraud as well. It's high-level funding, and I think that's very useful experience that could be very usefully put into the EPO.
Direkt dahinter, Kollege Omarjee, bitte.
Madame la Présidente, merci. Madame.
Thank you, Madam. Ms. Kovesi, you've already answered many questions. I just wanted to say that there are many of us here who are quite insensitive to the slandering campaign, and many of us recognize your courage. In your country, to a lesser degree, there have also been these campaigns throwing slander at prosecutors and magistrates. In that sense, magistrates and prosecutors are the same. They're similar. That is, that when they do a good job, they displease the executive. I have a question. You know that at the moment we're working on a text on alerts, triggers for alerts, which have an important role to play in revealing crime and irregularity, the case of the whistleblowers. I'm wondering whether you think that the case of whistleblowers should be put under the protection of the EPPO. I'm asking that question because that text has not yet gone to plenary. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very familiar with the concept of whistleblowers. Romania is a state that adopted special legislation for whistleblowers, and they also have certain protection measures conferred upon them, and there are clear rules in place for that. This works in Romania, but the decision to adopt that kind of directive at European level is a decision that is taken by co-legislators. As prosecutor, I can just give my opinion about what might be useful here, but I think the decision itself is taken by the co-legislators. I can say that in Romania we have special legislation for whistleblowers that works well, and at the DNA we also worked with whistleblowers.
Frau Kollegin Pitera.
Dziękuję Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have a question concerning the framework for the assessment of the EPPO. Do you believe that the prerogatives of the EPPO are sufficient in order to persecute financial crime efficiently? Thank you.
Necesitatea de a...
The need to adopt this regulation and create a European Public Prosecutor's Office was actually set out in Article 83 of the TFEU, if I'm not mistaken. But once again, I'll come back to this. The decision to expand the powers of the EPO actually is a decision for the co-legislators. It's very difficult to say right now that, yes, that's something that has to happen, that the powers need to be broadened. If you look at an example of fraud involving EU funds, that involves then financing of terrorist acts, then I would say that in a case like that, yes, you need to widen the powers of the EPO. But if we're talking about the protection of other values that are fundamental, then I might be tempted to say, well, at this point in time, let's just see if the EPO works well, how it works, and then later on we could take a decision on that. But this decision in any case is up to the co-legislators. What I would do, if I were given this opportunity, would be to analyze the crime patterns and analyze the way in which they are occurring and look at the proportions, and if there is a link between fraud and financial crimes and other serious crimes such as organized crime or terrorism. So look at the link between those kinds of crimes. And if you see there is a link established there, or a need for a broadening of powers for the EPO, or a need for changes that need to be brought about, then at that point we would be able to send our opinions into or to the co-legislators. We do not draft laws at the EPO. We offer expertise and opinions. And I think what's most important is that we're able to give opinions if there is legislation which creates an obstacle to the work that we are doing as prosecutors.
Thank you very much for this interesting hearing, for the time you had for us, and we would like to wish you good luck. Concerning the budget control members, we will continue our meeting after closure of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, if you could just bear with me for 1 second. I want to thank, just bear with me for 1 second. I'm just going to explain the procedure for both committees. Can I thank Ms Kovesi, first of all, for her participation in the hearing. Please, colleagues, just give me 1 minute. Just wanted to let Ms Kovesi know that after the hearing there will be a full evaluation of the hearing, and as with all the candidates, I will send a letter to President Tajani setting out our position and also the position of the Cont Committee as communicated by Ms Gressler. And thank you from our committee. And as you're leaving, I'm just going to make some announcements to the colleagues here. Thank you very much indeed. So, colleagues, colleagues, before you go, just quickly on the procedure for both committees. As regards the assessment of today's hearings, the Cont Committee will carry out their assessment this evening, and Ms Gressler will say something about that in a second, and she will give us a letter. Colleagues, it's just another 20 seconds, that's all. So Ms Gressler will then send a letter with her assessment. As regards LIBE, a coordinators meeting will take place tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and we've convened an extraordinary LIBE meeting at 11 o'clock, where there will also be a vote. So that's an extraordinary Libe meeting for those people who were not at committee this morning. This has been communicated, and that will replace a Libe meeting that was taking place on the 7th of March. So not extra work, but there will be a meeting tomorrow that will keep us in line with the procedure for Council. Okay, are there any questions? Then, Ms Gressler, did you want to say anything about the CONT? Okay, so there's a CONT meeting here, so now we can go. Thank you very much for your patience and resilience through this hearing. Thank you very much, colleagues.